What if the most consequential general of the Second World War never appeared on a single propaganda poster, never reviewed troops from a viewing stand with the dictator beside him, and remains today so obscure that his name rarely surfaces outside academic military history? What if the architect of Soviet victory, the man whose mind held the shapes of entire fronts, whose calculations determined when and where millions would move, spent the war not on horseback before cheering crowds, but hunched over maps in a building most soldiers never entered, most citizens never knew existed? This is the story of such a man. And if you find yourself drawn to these quieter histories, the hidden figures, and the architects who shaped the world from desks and dispatch centers, I'd invite you to subscribe for more journeys into the lives of those who changed everything while remaining almost invisible. Picture Moscow in the depths of winter, somewhere in the early 1940s. Snow falls steadily, thickly, past windows that are painted black, their glass sealed against the risk of shrapnel and the certainty that no light should leak into the night sky. Inside the General Staff building, the sounds are muted. Telephones ring occasionally, their bells somehow softer in the cold hours before dawn. Men in grey uniforms move through corridors lit by a few shielded bulbs, their footsteps absorbed by the heavy carpets that line the passageways. The air itself seems colder here than outside, or perhaps it only feels that way because of what occupies the minds of those who work within these walls. In one of these rooms, a room that would never be photographed, never be shown to any foreign visitor, never appear in any Soviet film or memoir written for public consumption, there sits a man at a large wooden table covered in maps. These are not ordinary maps. They are detailed, annotated, corrected by hand countless times over. They show the positions of Soviet armies, German armies, supply lines, railway networks, distances measured in kilometers that become, in translation, distances measured in human lives. The man studying these maps is tall, thin, with the kind of face that would be forgotten immediately after meeting. He has a high forehead, careful eyes, and a mouth that rarely settles into anything resembling a smile. His name is Aleksei Antonov, and in this moment, in this black-windowed room, he holds in his mind the operational movements of the entire Soviet war machine. But who is this man really? Few photographs exist of him, the Soviet propaganda apparatus, so devoted to the cult of personality, to the elevation of heroic figures, cast in bronze and painted in heroic murals, seems to have forgotten about Antonov almost entirely. There are no statues of him in any Russian city. His name does not appear with the frequency of Zhukov or Vasilevsky or Konev in the popular histories of the war, and yet, among those who knew him, among the officers who served under him, among the rare few who sat in Stalin's presence and observed how the dictator treated his generals, there was an understanding. Stalin trusted Antonov. Stalin, a man who trusted almost no one, who had spent the late 1930s systematically destroying his own officer corps through terror and purge, had somehow come to trust this quiet, unremarkable man in a way that transcended the usual paranoia. Why? What made Antonov different? The answer lies partly in his invisibility, partly in the precision of his mind, and partly in something more subtle, a kind of psychological calibration to the needs of autocracy. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand Antonov, we must first understand how a man becomes invisible in the Soviet Union, how a general manages to survive when so many others were destroyed, and how one quiet intelligence, one careful accumulation of competence in the unglamorous arts of logistics and planning, becomes indispensable to history's outcome. The winter continues outside, the snow will fall for hours yet. Inside the General Staff building, the maps remain unchanged for now, but the calculations proceed. Somewhere across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, armies are being positioned, supplies are being routed, the invisible architecture of war is being constructed by minds like Antonov's, minds that most of us will never know, will never hear celebrated, but whose work determined whether millions lived or died. This is not the story of a battlefield commander. This is not a narrative of famous victories and tactical genius displayed before photographers. This is the story of what happens in the hours between decisions, the work of a man whose greatest achievements would be known only to the few, whose name would not echo in public memory, but whose influence shaped the entire course of the war in the East. And so we begin in the cold, in the dark, in a room with maps and telephones, and a man who understood something fundamental about power, about service, about the way that one small, precise mind in the right position can alter the trajectory of nations. We begin with Aleksei Antonov, in his winter, in his obscurity, in the moment before the world would demand of him the greatest test of his career. The snowfall continued its steady work against the windows of that shuttered building, and within those rooms where maps were pinned and redrawn and pinned again, a man sat whose name would never appear on a Soviet postage stamp, whose face was rarely photographed, whose rank would remain mysteriously lower than nearly every general he served beside. This was Aleksei Mikhailovich Antonov, and the peculiarity of his position in history is worth lingering on for a moment, because it reveals something quieter and more durable about power than the usual portraits of military greatness allow us to see. Of all the senior Soviet commanders who survived the war and shaped its course, Antonov was the only one never elevated to the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union. Think on that for a moment. Zhukov received the honor, Vasilevsky received it. Konev and Rokossovsky and Chuikov and others, whose names still shine in military histories, all wore that supreme Soviet decoration at some point in their careers. Yet Antonov, who sat at the very center of operational planning for the entire Soviet war effort, who coordinated the movements of millions of soldiers across thousands of kilometers, who shaped some of the largest and most decisive campaigns in human history, from his desk in Moscow, he remained a colonel general. A senior rank, yes, but not the summit, not the star of the marshal. This absence is not an oversight of history. It was not an accident or a bureaucratic slight that went unnoticed. Antonov himself seems to have understood it with the calm acceptance he brought to most things. And yet Stalin, that brutal, paranoid dictator who trusted almost no one, who had purged his officer corps with such savagery that entire generations of experienced commanders had vanished into the dark, trusted Antonov in a way he trusted almost no other military man alive. Not perhaps with emotional warmth, Stalin was incapable of that, but with something more durable, with the kind of trust that comes from absolute reliance on competence and complete confidence in unswerving loyalty. So we find ourselves facing a puzzle at the very beginning of this man's story. Why would someone who held such trust, who wielded such influence over the course of the entire war, deliberately remain in the shadows? Was it a choice he made, or was it something imposed upon him? Was there some calculation, either Stalin's or his own, that kept him deliberately below the ceremonial heights where other generals climbed? Or was he simply a man whose nature inclined him toward the work itself rather than the medals that adorned it? To answer those questions properly, we need to understand who Antonov was before the war made him indispensable. We need to trace the quiet, unremarkable origins of a man who would become the hidden architect of Soviet victory, and to do that, we must travel backward through time into a Russia that no longer exists, into the childhood of a boy born into a world of empires and cavalry charges, of imperial uniforms and provincial garrison towns. We must find him where he began, before history called on him, before Moscow knew his name, before Stalin ever spoke it aloud in the Kremlin. But if you find yourself drawn to these sorts of stories, to the quiet histories of men who shaped their times from behind the scenes, to the slow unveiling of how power really works when stripped of propaganda and myth, to the accounts of competence and character told gently and without bombast, you might consider subscribing for more documentary journeys like this one. There are many such stories waiting in the archives of the Second World War, many forgotten architects and unseen hands that guided history through its darkest turning points. They are the kinds of histories that ask different questions, that reward patient listening, that give us glimpses into how the world actually changed when the grand speeches were finished and only the work remained. For now, though, Let us follow Antonov backward through time, into the snow and the ordinary days of his youth, to the small town where a boy was born, who would one day hold the fate of armies in his hands, yet would choose to remain unknown to the world. The snow in Moscow continued to fall, indifferent to the mysteries of rank and power and the strange arithmetic of Stalin's trust. And somewhere in that city, in the years to come, a man at a desk would trace lines on maps that would decide the fates of millions, and he would do it with the same quiet care he would bring to every task, seen or unseen, known or forgotten. To understand how a man becomes invisible, we must sometimes look at where he began, and in Aleksei Ivanovich Antonov's case, that beginning was nowhere in particular. He was born in the spring of 1896 in Grodno province, a region that lay in the western reaches of the Russian Empire, in what is now Belarus. His father, Ivan, held the modest rank of a minor nobleman and career officer, the kind of man whose name appeared in few records and whose ambitions, if he harbored any, remained entirely confined to the structures already in place. There was no revolutionary fire in the Antonov family, no radical plotting or artistic grandeur, just steady, quiet service, the kind that paid its dues and asked no questions. Grodno itself was a city of autumn mists and provincial rhythm, where the great historical dramas of empires seemed to move slowly, filtered through distance and the ordinary concerns of ordinary life. It was the sort of place where a child could grow up surrounded by military families, for Grodno had long been a garrison town, with soldiers and officers woven into the fabric of everyday existence, yet still emerge without any sense of exceptional destiny. Young Alexei would have known the sight of uniforms from his earliest years, the smell of parade grounds and barracks, the formal discipline that military families imposed upon their children, and yet there was nothing theatrical about it. It was simply how things were done. His childhood, insofar as history has recorded it, offers us very little. We know that he grew up in the twilight years of Imperial Russia, during a time of slow industrial change and quiet social tension that few in provincial garrison towns fully grasped. His mother remains almost entirely absent from the historical record, a detail that itself speaks volumes about the nature of such documentation. The focus, as always in military families of that era, fell upon the father and the son's expected trajectory. There would have been French tutors, perhaps, and certainly languages. Mathematics, the basic Greek and Latin that an officer's son was expected to master. Nothing exotic, nothing that suggested a mind destined for extraordinary strategic work, simply the curriculum of a certain class, delivered in the orderly manner that such families maintained. What is striking about Antonov's early years is precisely their absence of strikingness. Here was a boy who would later orchestrate the movements of millions, who would sit across from Stalin himself and speak with a clarity that few dared risk. Yet his boyhood left almost no impression upon anyone who might have recorded it. Did he stand out among his schoolmates? The sources do not say. Did he display any particular brilliance in mathematics or languages, any flash of precocious strategic thinking? History offers us no such convenient narrative. Instead, what we encounter is silence, which is, in its own way, a kind of answer. The young Antonov came of age in a Russia that was beginning to crack, though the cracks were not yet visible to those in provincial garrison towns. The Far Eastern War with Japan was already fading into the past when he would have been old enough to understand it. The revolutionary movements that would eventually tear the empire apart were still confined largely to the great cities, St. Petersburg, Moscow, the industrial centers. In Grodno, life continued its measured pace. There was the routine of school, the expectations of family, the almost unconscious absorption of military values that permeated the air he breathed. When it came time for his formal military education, Antonov followed the path that his station demanded. He entered the Imperial Military Academy, that institution which had for generations trained the officers of the Tsar. This was not a remarkable achievement, nor was it meant to be. Hundreds of officers' sons followed this path. They learned tactics and military science in the classical manner, studying campaigns that had already been fought, absorbing the wisdom of generals long dead. Antonov would have sat in classrooms with maps of European battlefields spread before him, studying the movements of cavalry and infantry according to principles that had held for a century. He would have learned to think in terms of lines and positions, of supply and fortifications, of the orderly arrangement of military forces according to rational principles. But here, perhaps, we begin to see the first stirrings of what would later define him. Among all those young officers learning the same lessons, Antonov appears to have possessed a particular gift, not for drama or personal distinction, but for the meticulous, unglamorous work of organization. He had an eye for how things fit together, for the thousand small details that, when coordinated properly, allowed large mechanisms to function smoothly. This was not the gift that the military academies celebrated. The celebrated gifts were boldness, charisma, the ability to make lightning decisions under fire. Organization and meticulous planning were necessary work, certainly, but they were the work of staff officers, the men who remained in headquarters while the famous generals received the commendations. Whether this represented a natural inclination or whether it emerged simply from his temperament is impossible now to determine. What we can say is that by the time Antonov completed his academy training, he had become precisely the kind of officer that armies require in their infrastructure but rarely sing about: competent, careful, and entirely unremarkable in any way that might have made him stand out at a ceremonial dinner. He had the skills that wars are actually won by, rather than the appearance of the qualities that wars are written about. The Russian Empire in those years was already descending toward its end, though few felt the urgency of that descent in the provinces. Antonov completed his military education as a young officer in the last years of a dynasty that had already begun to collapse. He emerged from his training as a young subaltern, competent, trained, but without any particular mark of destiny upon him. He would have worn his uniform with the proper bearing, maintained his discipline, and waited for assignment. There was no indication, in those early years, that this quiet young officer from a provincial garrison town would one day sit in the highest councils of a state yet to be born, guiding the movements of armies and the fates of millions. The path that would lead Aleksei Antonov toward greatness began, as many such paths do, with an almost unremarkable choice. In the early years of the 20th century, when the Russian Empire still stood intact and few could imagine the revolutions that would tear it apart, a young man from a modest background looked toward the military as a path of modest stability and modest honor. This was not uncommon. For boys without great family connections, the officer corps of the Tsar offered something precious: a uniform, a salary, and the possibility of advancement through competence alone. And so Antonov entered the military academy, leaving behind the provincial quietness of his childhood for the structured discipline of formal military training. The Tsarist military academies of that era were institutions caught between worlds. They taught the rigid hierarchies and parade ground traditions of the old imperial order, yet increasingly they were forced to grapple with the new realities of modern warfare. Artillery had grown more lethal. Fortifications had become more complex. The very nature of how armies coordinated their movements across vast distances was changing. Officers were expected to understand not only the pomp of command, but the mathematics of logistics, the careful calculation of supply lines, the geometry of defensive positions. For a young man like Antonov, whose mind seemed to work best when confronted with problems of organization and precision, this intellectual dimension of warfare held genuine appeal. What emerges from the fragmentary records of his academy years is a portrait of a student who was not flashy, not the sort to inspire dramatic tales. He was methodical. He was attentive. He earned respect rather than admiration, and that distinction would matter enormously in the decades to come. His instructors noted his capacity to absorb detail, to hold multiple pieces of information in his mind simultaneously, and to see how small decisions in one area of an operation might ripple across the entire structure. These were not the gifts that won battlefield laurels. These were the gifts of a staff officer, though no one may have named it so directly at the time. His early service in the Tsarist army placed him in a period of relative calm. The years after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, before the catastrophe of the Great War would shatter the old order entirely. Antonov served as a junior officer in various posts, continuing his education in the practical affairs of military administration. He was learning the language of dispatch and telegram, the careful coordination of units in garrison, the tedious but essential work of training and supervision. These were the years when a career officer learned the texture of military life, its rhythms and its codes, its unspoken understandings about rank and deference, and the flow of authority downward through layers of command. The Great War arrived when Antonov was in his 30s, and with it came a strange acceleration. The comfortable routines of peacetime garrison life gave way to something more desperate and more vast. The Russian army, like all the armies of that conflict, was thrown into a machinery of industrial slaughter that demanded more from its officers than had ever been demanded before. Guy had to flow across hundreds of kilometers, casualties had to be replaced. Trenches had to be dug and fortified. Coordination between units, separated by vast distances, had to occur with precision, or men would die uselessly. It was in this crucible that Antonov's particular gifts began to shine more visibly. He was not a man who would lead a cavalry charge or inspire troops by his personal bravery under fire, but he was a man who could keep a complex operation from falling into complete chaos, who could ensure that ammunition reached the front line when it was needed, who could understand the flow of an operation across a broad front and identify where the critical vulnerabilities lay. The war ground on, year after bloody year, and Russia's military machine groaned under the strain. The revolutions of 1917 came not as a shock to the army, but as a culmination. The officer corps was fragmented, exhausted, no longer certain of its purpose or its loyalty. Some officers rallied to the Whites and to the anti-Bolshevik cause. Others simply disappeared into the chaos of the civil war that followed. And some, like Antonov, made the choice to remain, to throw in their lot with the Red Army, despite the radical uncertainty of what that meant. The decision to serve the Red Army rather than flee or resist it was one that countless Tsarist officers faced in those years after 1917, and there is something almost unknowable about it now, something that belongs entirely to those who lived through it. Was it pragmatism? Was it a genuine conversion to the revolutionary cause? Was it simply the path of least resistance when all other paths seemed blocked? For Antonov, the historical record suggests a quieter calculus. He was a military professional. The Soviet state, whatever else one might say of it, needed military professionals. The Red Army was being built from nearly nothing, and men who understood the old military disciplines and structures were indispensable. Perhaps there was also in Antonov a certain faith that professional competence, the careful mastery of logistics and coordination, would matter more than ideology in the long run. If so, he would learn that this faith was both partly correct and profoundly naive. The Russian Civil War of 1918 through 1922 was a different kind of conflict than the Great War that had preceded it. It was more fluid, more chaotic, less dependent on the static lines and grinding artillery barrages that had characterized the trenches of the Western Front. It was a war of movement, of rapid maneuver across vast territories, of supply lines stretched thin across hostile country, of armies that shifted and reformed and sometimes dissolved entirely into fragments. For a man whose genius lay in organization rather than improvisation, this must have posed constant challenges. And yet it was precisely this sort of chaos that made meticulous staff work, careful planning, and precise coordination all the more valuable. When the world around you is dissolving into disorder, the officer who can impose structure and clarity becomes essential. Antonov's service during the Civil War is less well documented than one might wish. He moved through various assignments, working primarily in staff positions, contributing his organizational talents to the various fronts where the Red Army fought against white forces and foreign interventions. He was present at moments of great historical significance, without being the central figure in any of them. He learned the vast scale of Soviet geography, the true distances involved in moving armies across the Eurasian continent. He learned to work with commanders of varying talents and temperaments. He learned to stay calm in situations where panic might be understandable. He learned to trust in the power of careful planning, even when circumstances beyond planning's control were unfolding around him. By the end of the Civil War, when the Red Army emerged as the victor and the Soviet Union began to consolidate its power, Antonov was still a relatively junior officer. He had no great fame. He had won no medals for battlefield heroism. He had not led dramatic cavalry charges or authored famous military treatises. But he had survived, which in itself was no small thing, and he had accumulated, almost without anyone noticing it, a vast reservoir of practical knowledge about how to move armies, how to supply them, how to coordinate their movements across impossible distances. The skills that would eventually make him invaluable to Stalin were forming quietly, year by year, assignment by assignment, in the unglamorous work of military administration and staff planning. Few could have predicted, in those early post-war years of the 1920s, that a man so unremarkable, so devoted to the quiet details of organization, would one day stand at the center of Soviet power, whispering in the ear of a dictator who trusted almost no one. And so Antonov moved through the 1920s and into the 1930s, not as a name that appeared in newspapers or in the triumphalist chronicles of the young Soviet state, but as a figure of steady, almost invisible advancement through the machinery of military institutions. The Russian Civil War had ended. The revolutionary chaos that had consumed his early years as a Red Army officer had given way, slowly, to something more orderly, something that required not the improvised heroism of a cavalry charge or the desperation of a last stand, but the patient, methodical architecture of professional military science. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable in appearance during these years. Photographs from the period, rare as they are, show a man of medium height, with the bearing of a staff officer rather than a field commander. There was nothing in his face that suggested the capacity to reshape battlefields or to plan the movements of armies. Yet it was precisely in this unremarkable quality that his true character was forming, grain by grain, like sediment settling in still water. The Soviet military establishment of the interwar period was undergoing a profound transformation. The Red Army was shedding its revolutionary character and attempting to build something more systematic, more scientific. There was hunger in Moscow during these years for officers who understood not just tactics, not just the courage that had won the Civil War, but logistics, supply lines, the movement of thousands of tons of material across vast distances, the coordination of multiple units operating in coordination with one another, rather than in isolated pockets of desperate resistance. These were the skills that would win the next war, if the next war came, and it was becoming increasingly clear to Soviet planners that one would come. Antonov gravitated towards staff work with what appears, in hindsight, to be an almost natural inevitability. He was assigned to the Academy of the Red Army General Staff, that austere institution located in Moscow, where officers came to unlearn the habits of the Civil War and to learn instead the languages of modern warfare: mathematics, logistics, intelligence assessment, the careful construction of operational plans that could be transmitted by telegram and telephone across thousands of kilometers. It is worth pausing here to consider what staff work truly meant in this context. It was not the work of heroes. It produced no battlefield glory, no personal valor that newspapers could celebrate. Instead, it was the work of careful men bent over maps, using colored pencils and string and mathematical calculations to determine the most efficient path for thousands of soldiers to move across territory. It was the work of understanding that an army marching without adequate supplies was an army marching toward defeat. It was the unglamorous calculation of how many trucks could transport how many tons of grain and ammunition over how many kilometers in how many days. It was the construction of order out of the chaos inherent in any large military movement. Antonov seemed to possess an almost meditative ability to concentrate on these details without becoming lost in them, without letting them overwhelm him into paralysis. Other officers found the minutiae of logistics deadening, something to be delegated to quartermasters and supply officers of lower rank. Antonov seemed to find in them something almost engaging, a puzzle to be solved through careful thinking and clear analysis. How could you move an army of 500,000 men across difficult terrain in winter? How could you coordinate the actions of multiple fronts so that they struck their blows simultaneously rather than piecemeal? How could you ensure that the moment your plans were set in motion, the machinery you had assembled would function with precision rather than falling apart into confusion? These were the questions that occupied his mind during the late 1920s and into the 1930s as he studied and worked his way through the General Staff Academy, absorbing the technical knowledge that had accumulated in European military theory, learning the languages of operational planning that had been refined through decades of warfare and study. He was, in a sense, acquiring a kind of literacy, a fluency in a language that very few men in the Soviet Union understood. There was something almost ascetic about this accumulation of knowledge. Antonov did not seek fame or recognition for his studies. He did not publish theoretical works that would have made his name known to the wider officer corps. Instead, he worked quietly, mastering the details of his craft the way a medieval craftsman might have mastered the intricacies of his trade, not because anyone was watching or rewarding him for it, but because the work itself demanded nothing less than competence. His instructors at the General Staff Academy seemed to have recognized in him the kind of officer the Red Army would need in its higher councils. There was about Antonov a quality of trustworthiness that went beyond mere technical proficiency. Officers who are merely technically skilled can still be dangerous. They can be ambitious, vain, prone to grand gestures, and risk-taking that serves their own advancement rather than military necessity. But Antonov gave the impression, even in these early years, of being someone whose judgment could be trusted, who would tell you the truth about a situation even when the truth was uncomfortable, who would execute a plan with precision, regardless of whether that plan would bring him personal glory. By the early 1930s, Antonov had consolidated his knowledge and his reputation among the small circle of officers who understood the complexities of modern staff work. He had not yet become a name that mattered in the wider Soviet state. He had published nothing that would make him known to politicians. He had no mentor among the marshals who had become famous during the Civil War, yet he had acquired something more valuable than any of those things. He had acquired competence, real, deep, hard-won competence in a field that was becoming increasingly central to the nature of modern warfare. The world was changing around him during these years, growing darker and more threatening. In Germany, the National Socialists were rising to power. In Japan, the military was growing increasingly aggressive. The Soviet Union faced the prospect of a two-front war, a nightmare scenario that kept the strategic planners in Moscow awake at night. And within the Soviet Union itself, forces that would soon transform into something terrible were beginning to gather. But none of that was yet visible in the quiet work of an officer hunched over maps and logistical calculations in a Moscow office building. Antonov simply continued to study, to learn, to accumulate the skills that might, if events unfolded in a particular way, make him indispensable to the state. He had no way of knowing that those events would indeed unfold in precisely that way, or that his quiet competence would come to matter more than he could possibly have imagined. The decade before the war, in the middle years of the 1930s, brought a particular kind of darkness across the Soviet officer corps. Not the darkness of night, but something quieter and more suffocating, a darkness that moved through hallways and into the minds of men who had survived revolution and civil war, only to find themselves facing something far more insidious. What had the Red Army done to deserve the attention of the state's security apparatus? Nothing, perhaps, and everything. The suspicion alone was enough. Starting in 1937, though the roots ran deeper into 1936, Stalin had become convinced, or had allowed himself to be convinced by his security chief Nikolai Yezhov, that the officer corps harbored enemies, saboteurs, hidden fascists, Japanese spies, German infiltrators. The accusations were baroque in their paranoia, designed not to be plausible, but to be devastating. A general who had served in the White Army during the Civil War, even 40 years earlier, might suddenly be called a monarchist. A staff officer who had studied German military theory might be unmasked as a Nazi sympathizer. No logic governed the selections. No trial in any meaningful sense protected anyone. Terror, as an instrument, requires only appearance, not substance. The numbers were staggering. Between 1937 and 1938, upward of 35,000 military officers were arrested, roughly half of the Soviet officer corps at the time. Some were shot immediately, others were sent to labor camps where they died slowly in the frozen north. The psychological weight of this knew no bounds. How did a man go to work in the morning when his colleagues were simply vanishing, when yesterday's commander was today's enemy of the state? When denunciation was a path to favor and silence was a path to suspicion, the paranoia created a particular kind of isolation. Officers would not speak freely even with those closest to them. A stray comment, overheard and reported, could mean death. Wives and families were often implicated alongside the arrested men. Children of purged officers faced suspicion in school. The fear was not momentary but chronic, a background hum beneath every conversation, every decision, every moment of professional life. You could not know who was an informant. You could not trust that your own words would not be weaponized against you in a darkened basement of the Lubyanka. Here, perhaps, Antonov's very unremarkableness began to work in his favor, though one must be careful with such speculation, since we cannot enter the mind of the security apparatus or know precisely why certain men were selected for death and others were left untouched. Yet the pattern is worth noting, the texture of it worth sitting with for a moment. Antonov was not a public figure, he gave no speeches, he had no party affiliations of significance, he did not cultivate a faction around himself, he had not served as a Tsarist officer in any capacity that could be revisited and weaponized. His family background was modest, uncomplicated by aristocratic pretensions or bourgeois sympathies. He had never written extensively or made bold pronouncements about strategy that might later be deemed heretical. Most importantly, perhaps, he worked in the shadows. In the 1930s, while other officers were commanding armies, building reputations, making themselves visible to the state, and thus visible to its accusers, Antonov was deep in the organizational machinery of the General Staff. He was studying logistics. He was learning the intricacies of how fronts communicated with Moscow, how supplies moved across vast distances, how men and material could be coordinated across an empire. This was unglamorous work. It was not the kind of work that made a man a rival for power. It was not the kind of work that attracted the paranoid eye of a dictator looking for conspirators. The officers who were most visible, the ones commanding military districts, the ones attending Politburo meetings, the ones with ambition written plainly on their faces, these were the ones who fell first and most heavily. The marshals, the army commanders, the men whose names appeared in Pravda and whose photographs decorated military buildings. Antonov, by contrast, was unknown to the general public. Unknown, perhaps, to Stalin's security apparatus as well. Not unnoticed, he was competent and beginning to be recognized for that competence, but not important enough to seem dangerous. One must speak carefully here, because certainty is not possible. We do not have documents that say explicitly, Antonov survived because he was obscure. But the texture of survival during the purges suggests that obscurity was a form of protection. Those who were noticed least were safest. Those who had made powerful enemies, or had drawn the eye of rivals seeking to eliminate competition through denunciation, or who occupied visible positions of authority, these men fell. Antonov was not entirely invisible. His superiors knew his worth, but he was not prominent enough to be feared, not ambitious enough to be resented, not political enough to be suspected. The purges created a military apparatus that was, by 1939, severely weakened. Junior officers were hastily promoted to replace the executed men, regardless of whether they had the experience or knowledge to do so. Entire chains of command had been fractured. The institutional memory of the Red Army had been damaged. Yet from this catastrophe emerged a paradox. The vacuum left by the purges created opportunities for those who had survived, particularly those whose competence could not be denied. When the war came, the Soviet military would need men who could think clearly under pressure, who understood logistics and operations, who could work with Stalin without either cringing or confronting him. Men like Antonov would be essential precisely because so many others had been destroyed. But for now, in the late 1930s, that future was invisible. Antonov continued his work, kept his head down, accumulated knowledge in the quiet spaces of the General Staff building while the storm raged around him. Whether he was aware that his obscurity was protecting him, whether he had chosen it deliberately as a survival strategy, or whether it was simply the natural temperament of a man who preferred competence to ambition, we cannot know. What we can say is that he endured. While men he had studied with, men who had seemed to have brighter futures, were disappearing into the night, Antonov remained, and that survival, quiet and unheralded, would prove to be one of the most consequential facts of the Second World War. In the early hours of Sunday, June 22, 1941, the western sky above the Soviet Union began to glow orange. Antonov was somewhere in the vast machinery of the General Staff in Moscow when the telegraph lines started burning with reports. Operation Barbarossa had begun. 3 million German soldiers were pouring across the border in the single largest invasion force the world had ever assembled, and in those first moments of chaos, the Red Army was fragmenting. The military districts nearest the German frontier simply ceased to exist in any organized sense. Communication broke down almost immediately. Officers were dead or captured or wandering in confusion. Whole formations of Soviet troops, caught in their barracks or spread across staging areas, were being obliterated by waves of Luftwaffe bombers before they could even mount a coherent defense. The Western Front at Bialystok, the Southwestern Front near the Prut River, these were not controlled retreats or strategic withdrawals. These were catastrophes unfolding in real time. Within 48 hours, the Soviet Union had lost more aircraft than existed in the entire German Air Force. Within a week, hundreds of thousands of men were dead or imprisoned or streaming backward toward Moscow in a desperate attempt to avoid encirclement. It is in this moment, amid the convulsion of an empire's first contact with total defeat, that we begin to see what Antonov was made of. While senior officers were attempting to process the sheer magnitude of the disaster, while some were paralyzed with fear of what Stalin would do to them for failing to prevent the invasion, Antonov moved with the kind of terrible clarity that only emerges when the stakes become absolute. He was not commanding troops in the field. He was not a marshal with his face painted across Soviet newspapers. He was a colonel in the General Staff, one among many, and yet something about his mind worked in the way that the moment demanded. The chaos had to be organized, maps had to be redrawn, reports had to be collected, sifted, verified. New positions had to be established, communications re-established where possible, fragments of units coordinated into something resembling a defense. This was not the work of genius or inspiration. This was the work of a man who understood that in catastrophe, the only weapon more powerful than panic was order. The only antidote to dissolution was the patient, meticulous reconstruction of structure. In those first frantic weeks, Antonov began to emerge as something rare in the Soviet officer corps, a man who did not shout, who did not bluster, who did not attempt to mask the disaster with false confidence or revolutionary fervor. Instead, he simply worked. 16-hour days at the map tables, telephone calls to what remained of the fronts, coordination with Vasilevsky and with Shaposhnikov, the aging but still formidable chief of the General Staff, who recognized almost immediately that Antonov possessed exactly what the situation required, a mind that could hold complexity without fracturing under its weight. There is something almost paradoxical about watching competence emerge in catastrophe. The very nature of disaster strips away pretense. Incompetence becomes immediately visible when millions of lives depend on decisions. And conversely, a man who can think clearly under pressure, who can absorb bad news without flinching, who can organize the reorganization of chaos itself, such a man becomes invaluable simply through the absence of alternatives. In a military culture that often prized aggression and romantic notions of battlefield glory, Antonov's very ordinariness became his greatest strength. Within a month, he had proven himself indispensable in the southwestern theater, where the German Army Group South under Rundstedt was driving deep into Ukraine. A Soviet counterattack was being planned, and Antonov was tasked with the operational coordination. It would fail, ultimately. The Germans were simply too strong, too well supplied, too experienced in the kind of mobile warfare that had devastated the Soviet mechanized corps. But the way in which it failed mattered. There was no panic in the planning, no wild, desperate gambles divorced from available resources. The operation was conceived with a cold realism about what could and could not be done. And when it became clear that it could not succeed, the retreat, while costly, was managed with enough order to prevent total annihilation. This is the beginning of a pattern that would define Antonov's war. He was not a general who would win battles through boldness or innovation, or the kind of crushing numerical superiority that characterized Soviet victories in later years. He was, rather, a general who prevented defeat from becoming obliteration. In a war where the Soviet Union could absorb incredible losses and still endure, where the mathematics of attrition eventually favored the defender despite catastrophic initial defeats, the ability to lose in an orderly manner, to retreat without fracturing, to maintain communications and command structure through withdrawal, was itself a strategic asset of immense value. By the end of 1941, as the Wehrmacht began to stumble in the mud and snow around Moscow, Antonov had moved from the southwestern theater into the nerve center of Soviet military power. He was, by all accounts, running on almost no sleep. The pattern that would define his entire war was establishing itself. The absence of his name from newspapers, the presence of his fingerprints on every major operational coordination, the utter invisibility of a man whose work was shaping the flow of events across thousands of kilometers of front. One might wonder whether this suited him temperamentally, or whether he was simply too valuable in this role to be spared for field command. The answer is almost certainly both. There is evidence in the historical record, fragmentary as it always is with such figures, that Antonov possessed a kind of monk-like acceptance of his place in the machinery. He was not ambitious in the conventional sense. He did not angle for promotion or political favor. He did not cultivate the kind of revolutionary credentials that mattered in Stalin's officer corps. He simply did the work that was in front of him, and did it with such methodical precision that the work itself became the credential. The months ahead would demand everything such a man could offer. The war was only beginning, in a sense. The initial German offensive had failed to destroy Soviet power, but the fighting would continue for nearly 4 more years. The casualties would mount into the millions. The demands on the general staff for coordination, for planning, for the orchestration of resources and men, and time itself, would only intensify. And Antonov would be at the center of it, quiet and unseen, the kind of indispensable figure that history often forgets, because his greatest achievement was not winning something, but preventing something even worse from happening, and making that prevention look as inevitable as the rising of the sun. When the Wehrmacht's mechanized columns tore through the Soviet lines in the summer of 1941, the southern and southwestern theaters became a kind of purgatory. The maps themselves seemed to mock the officers trying to defend them, vast, austere, with lines that shifted and dissolved daily. The German advance followed the contours of rivers and railways, and the Soviet commanders found themselves perpetually off balance, trying to react rather than anticipate. This is where Antonov's true work began, though few would recognize it at the time. He arrived in the southwestern sector as the situation had already begun to deteriorate into something between organized retreat and controlled collapse. The cities of Ukraine lay exposed. The industrial heartlands that Stalin had built and rebuilt through such suffering now stood vulnerable to capture or destruction. When a general was sent to organize the coordination of a crumbling front, the work was rarely celebrated, and the weight of it fell silently, exhaustingly, on men like Antonov, men who understood that armies did not move by courage alone, but by supply lines, by signal corps, by the unglamorous machinery of order imposed upon chaos. What distinguished Antonov in those terrible months was not his battlefield presence, though he traveled to the front regularly, but his ability to impose rational systems onto situations that seemed fundamentally irrational. While other generals were being caught up in the drama of the moment, in the urgent demands of Stalin's telephone calls and the desperate orders flowing down from above, Antonov was doing something quieter and far more difficult. He was learning the temperament of the Southwestern Front, its corps commanders, its logistical weaknesses, the rhythm of its communication networks. He began to map not just territory, but capacity. How many men could move from point A to point B in a given time? Which roads could sustain what weight of traffic? Where were the bottlenecks that would choke any attempted maneuver? The retreat across the Don and toward the Volga became, in a peculiar way, his finishing school. Other officers saw only disaster. Antonov saw a puzzle with constraints. The Germans were faster, better trained, and possessed superior armor. So if a Soviet commander could not match them in speed or shock power, what could he do? He could organize space. He could trade distance for time, and time for the arrival of reserves. He could ensure that when a unit fell back, it fell back in formation, not in panic. He could make certain that the next position was prepared before the previous one was abandoned. These were the thoughts of a man thinking in systems rather than episodes. The evacuation of industrial capacity from the threatened zones became, in a strange sense, his laboratory. As factories were disassembled and moved eastward, a staggering logistical feat undertaken under fire, Antonov worked to synchronize these movements with military operations. The front had to hold long enough for the machines to escape. The machines had to reach the east in time to begin producing the weapons the front would desperately need. This was not glamorous work. It was the work of coordination and timing, of ensuring that moving trains were not captured by fast-moving cavalry, of calculating reserves and consumption rates with the cold precision of an accountant. His reputation began to shift, subtly but measurably. Officers who had dismissed him as a mere staff officer, a man with ink on his fingers and lines on his maps but no fire in his blood, began to notice something. When Antonov sent instructions, things happened. When he coordinated a retreat, it was not a rout. When he organized a counterattack, it had the strange quality of succeeding not because of overwhelming force, but because every element appeared at the right moment in the right place. He seemed to know things before they occurred, not through clairvoyance, but through the simple and devastating power of thinking several moves ahead. The battles that raged across southern Russia throughout 1941 and into 1942 were nightmarish. Rostov, the Don, the approaches to Stalingrad itself. These were grinding, desperate affairs, with no clear victory for either side, only the question of whose reserves would outlast whose. And in this environment of mud, exhaustion, and incompleteness, Antonov became known as a general who made things work. He was not the kind of commander whose name would appear in German prisoner interrogations as someone to be feared. He was not the kind of general whose recklessness or brilliance became the subject of hushed conversations in officers' clubs. Instead, he was the kind of man that other officers simply trusted. When you received an order from Antonov, you knew it was possible. You knew he had thought through the implications. You knew that if it failed, it would not be because of careless planning. This reputation for meticulous work, for the unglamorous business of making machines function in conditions designed to break them, became his signature. In the Soviet General Staff, where personalities often loomed large, and where connections to party hierarchies could matter as much as military ability, Antonov represented something different. He represented competence as a form of authority. He did not raise his voice unnecessarily. He did not seek promotion or visibility. He appeared to care only about whether the thing he was asked to do could be accomplished, and if so, how to accomplish it most efficiently. The psychological distance between this kind of work and the romantic notion of generalship cannot be overstated. Battlefield commanders, no matter how careful they were, dealt in moments of decision and actions whose consequences were immediately visible. Antonov dealt in consequences that were distributed across time and space, often invisible. He was orchestrating the movement of hundreds of thousands of men, and yet his actual influence was exercised through memoranda, telephone conversations, and the placement of small marks on maps. Did the withdrawal from Rostov succeed because of his planning, or because the Germans paused? The answer was probably both, and Antonov would have been interested primarily in the first question, the one within his control, while remaining vigilant about the second. By the time the catastrophe at Stalingrad was beginning to gather force on the horizon, Antonov had already demonstrated something that few Soviet generals could claim. He had managed retreat without breaking. He had organized operations on a massive scale without losing coherence. He had survived contact with Stalin's telephone without saying yes to the impossible or no to the demanding. And he had built a reputation not on flash or visibility, but on a kind of reliability that was quietly becoming indispensable. Other generals might be more famous. Other generals might have more medals or more public recognition. But among those who understood how modern armies actually functioned, Antonov was becoming known as the man who made things possible. To understand what Antonov truly became, we must step back from the forward rush of battle and descend instead into the rooms where maps were drawn and decisions were whispered into the darkness. The Soviet General Staff during the war was not, as outsiders often imagined, a place of uniforms shouting orders and dramatic confrontations. It was quieter than that, colder, a machine made of paper and telephones and the exhausted minds of men who rarely saw daylight. Picture the building itself, standing on Gogol Boulevard in Moscow. By 1943 and 1944, when Antonov's influence had grown to near invisibility except to those who needed him most, the corridors were a maze of small offices and larger planning rooms where the walls held maps. Vast, intricate maps of the Eastern Front, updated constantly with colored pins and careful annotations. These were not the maps you see in history books, simplified for comprehension. These were chaos made orderly, every German unit marked, every Soviet position fixed by radio report, by railway manifest, by scouts returning from the darkness, every supply line traced in blue pencil, every fuel dump, every ammunition depot, every bridge, every river that might stop a tank column. A chief of operations, which is what Antonov became as he rose through the ranks of the General Staff, did not command armies. Let this be clear from the outset. He never stood on a ridge overlooking a battlefield or made the decision to send a division forward. That belonged to the front commanders, the men whose names would live in Soviet memory. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, the men who appeared in photographs and newsreels. But a chief of operations was something quieter, and in ways that are difficult to explain, more structurally important. He was the keeper of coordination, the man who held the entire front in his mind at once. On any given night during a major operation, Antonov would move between rooms. First, the operations room itself, where officers sat at desks monitoring the telephones. The Soviet military had learned, through terrible losses in 1941 and 1942, that armies moved on communication. A telephone line cut by artillery fire could mean the difference between a coordinated breakthrough and a confused collapse. The chief of operations knew this in his bones. He knew the weight of waiting for a radio operator to raise a front commander in the field. He knew the sound of static and what it meant when a line went dead. The telephone system connecting Moscow to the fronts was fragile, temperamental. A general might ring the general staff and reach through layers of relay operators and radio booths, the signal crackling, voices distorted as if they were speaking across an impossible distance rather than across the same 1,000 kilometers they had crossed with tanks. Information moved backward over these lines. Damage reports, casualty figures, fuel consumption, the speed of advances, or the grim news of retreats. And forward flowed orders, corrections, adjustments, the endless refinements that kept 1 million men moving in something approaching a unified direction. A chief of operations read these reports the way a doctor reads a patient's breathing. There was rhythm to it, patterns. If a front commander's reports began arriving later than expected, he noticed. If ammunition expenditure climbed suddenly beyond projections, his mind flagged it. If 3 separate division commanders reported encountering more resistance than anticipated in a certain sector, he would cross-reference maps, consider terrain, weigh whether this suggested something the high command had missed, and then he would pick up a telephone and speak a few quiet words to Zhukov or Vasilevsky or Stalin himself. The paperwork alone would crush a lesser mind. The Soviet system demanded documentation with an almost religious fervor, partly because Stalin did not trust memory and partly because the scale of operations was simply too vast to hold without written records. Every decision memorialized, every plan typed and stamped, every message logged. Antonov's days began in darkness and often ended in darkness. The photostat machines would be running continuously, clerks moving between offices carrying folders, the smell of lamp oil and tobacco, and the particular mustiness of maps that have been handled too many times. What might surprise those unfamiliar with staff work is how much of it involved not command but negotiation. A front commander would telephone with a request, more ammunition, additional divisions, a delay in the scheduled start of a new operation. The chief of operations could not simply grant it. He had to consider the supply situation across the entire front. He had to look at other sectors where the same resources might be needed just as desperately. He had to think 5 days ahead, then 10. He had to imagine what would happen to the entire operation if this one request were granted, and what would happen if it were denied. Then he had to explain his reasoning to men who were exhausted and desperate and whose soldiers were dying. This required not just military knowledge, but a kind of subtle authority, the ability to say no to a field commander in such a way that the man understood the refusal was not personal, not political, but mathematical, born of genuine necessity. The maps, though, the maps deserve their own quiet meditation. Imagine them, drawn on sheets so large that a man standing before them could see an entire sector of the front spread before him like a landscape. The Germans held certain territory rendered in blue or red pencil, Soviet forces in other colors, the topography rendered carefully. Hills would slow an advance, rivers would stop it entirely unless bridges could be secured or crossings forced. Forests meant ambush. Open ground meant vulnerability to aircraft. Every feature of the landscape was information. A chief of operations would stand before such maps with subordinates gathered around, and he would trace with his finger the route of a proposed advance. How long would it take? What resistance would be encountered? Where would supply lines be most vulnerable? Where might German counterattacks emerge? These were not rhetorical questions. They were calculations requiring real answers. One might imagine the strange intimacy of this work. Antonov, standing in lamplight at 3 a.m, with perhaps 5 other senior officers, studying a map of the southern Ukrainian front. Each man is exhausted. Each man is terrified, in his way, not of artillery fire but of miscalculation, of proposing an operation that would fail, of recommending a deployment that would waste lives needlessly, of Stalin's displeasure. The fear in staff work is different from fear in the trenches, but it is no less real. The sleepless nights were not romantic or dramatic. They were simply the texture of the work. In 1943, during the preparations for the Battle of Kursk, Antonov worked in a state of controlled fatigue for weeks. Reports arrived continuously. Reconnaissance information about German positions, weather forecasts, railway timetables showing when supplies could be moved, casualty replacements being processed through the system, the output of factories measured in tank chassis and ammunition cases. All of this flowed toward the General Staff, and from there, it had to be synthesized, made coherent, turned into operational parameters that would guide the actions of millions of men spread across a front measuring hundreds of kilometers. What did Antonov actually do during these nights? He listened, he read, he asked precise questions that would have seemed oddly technical to an outsider, but which revealed either confidence or dangerous gaps in planning. He modified timelines, he proposed alternatives, he sometimes said no, not often, but memorably. He occasionally picked up a telephone and spoke to Stalin with a quietness that suggested complete certainty, and somehow the certainty was sufficient. He existed in a state of perpetual problem-solving, his mind turned outward toward hundreds of thousands of men and machinery, his personality turned inward into reserve. This was the opposite of the battlefield general, the charismatic commander who inspired through presence and oratory. Antonov inspired through the accuracy of his calculations and the reliability of his judgment. And perhaps most importantly, he understood that the General Staff was not the seat of ultimate power. It was the seat of ultimate responsibility. The front commanders, the political officers, the tank crews in the snow, they would receive the credit or the blame for what happened. The General Staff would receive only the satisfaction of having prepared the ground as thoroughly as human capability allowed. There was something austere in this, something that perhaps suited Antonov's temperament perfectly. By the autumn of 1942, the Great Bend in the Volga River had become something more than a city. It had become the furnace where the entire German campaign in the east was burning away. Stalingrad, as you might imagine, cast its shadow over everything in the Soviet command structure. The battle consumed attention the way fire consumes wood, relentlessly, and in Moscow, in the corridors of the General Staff building, something began to shift. The grand strategies that had failed before required new minds, or perhaps the old minds working in new configurations. Antonov, who had been moving steadily through the ranks of operational planning, found himself increasingly present in the rooms where fate was being plotted onto maps. The city on the Volga represented a turning point, though no one in those early months of fighting could have sensed it yet. The Germans threw their strength at the urban labyrinth with mechanical precision, and the Soviets poured reinforcements into that grinding meat grinder with grim determination. And somewhere in the middle of this collision, in the vast difference between where the front line was and where it needed to be, lived the work of the General Staff. Every decision, every redeployment of reserves, every calculation of supply lines and ammunition trains, these required minds that could hold the entire complexity of the Soviet war effort in their thoughts at once. This was the realm in which Antonov had been quietly developing his expertise. What happened at Stalingrad, though, was not simply a battle. It was a revelation about what the Soviet military could accomplish when its planning was sound and its execution was unified. By late November, when Operation Uranus began, the great encirclement that would trap the Sixth Army, the architecture of that operation bore the fingerprints of the General Staff's most careful thinkers. Antonov was not the sole architect of this plan, you understand. Alexander Vasilevsky had emerged as one of Stalin's most trusted operational minds, and Georgy Zhukov, already legendary, remained the dominant figure. But Antonov's hand was there, in the precise calculations, in the orchestration of forces across that enormous front, in the kind of work that required not inspiration, but relentless, methodical brilliance. As Stalingrad moved from a German offensive to a Soviet encirclement, something crystallized in the Moscow hierarchy. It became clear, if it had not been already, that Antonov possessed a particular gift, not for dramatic gestures or for inspiring men in the field, but for seeing what needed to happen and ensuring that it happened. His work was invisible to propaganda, unsuitable for photographs, difficult to explain to the Soviet public hungry for heroes with recognizable faces, and yet it was indispensable. In that paradoxical way that staff work operates, Antonov became more valuable precisely because he was not famous, because he could function without requiring credit or recognition, because his ego was somehow subordinated entirely to the work itself. Vasilevsky, who directed the Stalingrad operation from the front, found in Antonov a collaborator of rare quality. When you think of the relationship between a front commander and the general staff in Moscow, it is rather like the relationship between a musician and the symphony, complex, interdependent, requiring absolute trust on both sides. Vasilevsky was proving himself as a supreme coordinator of multiple fronts, a man who could hold the enormous battlefield in his mind. But behind Vasilevsky stood the apparatus, and Antonov was becoming one of the central figures in that apparatus. Their working relationship, forged through the crucible of Stalingrad's planning and execution, would deepen over the next 2 years into a profound professional partnership. Following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad in early 1943, the General Staff began to reorganize itself around the reality that the war would be long and would require sustained coordination of unimaginable scope. The German offensive at Kursk was already being anticipated, even predicted, by Soviet intelligence and strategic planning. This required a general staff that was not merely reactive, but truly generative of strategy. Antonov, in these months, began to move further into the inner circles. He was no longer an officer of promise, developing his skills. He was becoming an essential part of the machinery by which Stalin's war was being fought. It was in 1943 that Antonov formally entered the position that would define the remainder of the war, though the exact date and title shifted somewhat with Stalin's constant reorganizations and rebranding of positions. He became Chief of Operations at the General Staff, working under and increasingly alongside Vasilevsky, who held the grander title of Chief of Staff of the Supreme High Command. In practical terms, this meant that Antonov was now the man through whose hands passed the operational plans for the entire Eastern Front. Every movement of armies, every deployment of strategic reserves, every calculation of what was possible and what was impossible, these now came through Antonov's office. The work was invisible but total. Imagine a room in a Moscow winter, snow pressing against the windows, the electric lights burning through the dark afternoons, maps spread across enormous tables, telephone lines running in all directions, couriers arriving from the fronts with reports of enemy movements, of unit strengths, of supply situations, officers bent over the maps, moving markers representing hundreds of thousands of men. And at the center of this machinery, increasingly, sat Antonov, not shouting orders, not demanding attention, simply present, thinking, making observations that others had not made, catching errors that would have cost lives, seeing possibilities that were invisible to less systematic minds. Vasilevsky, who now held a rank that gave him extraordinary authority and access to Stalin himself, began to rely on Antonov in ways that suggested a complete professional confidence. When Vasilevsky traveled to the fronts, he carried with him the plans that Antonov had refined. When Vasilevsky sat with Stalin, he presented the options that Antonov's staff had developed and analyzed. In this fashion, Antonov entered the inner circle, not through political maneuvering or through party connections, but through the sheer indispensability of his competence. He was the man who made things work, who ensured that the vast organism of Soviet military power functioned with something approaching coordination and rationality. What is perhaps most striking about this transition is how utterly quiet it was. There were no promotions announced in Pravda. There were no speeches celebrating Antonov's role. To the outside world, and indeed to most of the Soviet officer corps, Antonov remained relatively obscure. This was, in its own way, a form of protection. In an army where ambitious men often found themselves in danger, in a system where visibility could be as perilous as incompetence, Antonov's invisibility served him well. He existed in a realm apart from the propaganda machinery, in a space where results mattered more than appearances. In the late hours of Moscow nights, when the Kremlin's corridors grew quieter and the urgency of daytime briefings had settled into exhaustion, Stalin would sometimes reach for his telephone to summon Antonov, not Zhukov, whom he both feared and admired, not Vasilevsky, who carried the burden of frontier command, but Antonov, the general who moved through the General Staff building like a man who understood that the most important work happened in silence, away from the eyes of photographers and the ears of ambitious rivals. The relationship between them was, by all accounts, unusual. Stalin had built his power on a foundation of terror and suspicion so complete that intimacy with him was itself a kind of danger. He trusted no one deeply, yet he seemed to trust Antonov in a way that observers found difficult to fully explain. Perhaps it was because Antonov asked for nothing. He sought no public credit, no marshalling, no grand parade of his accomplishments. He simply appeared when called, listened to what the dictator demanded, and then quietly disappeared into his work. Stalin's nature was volcanic. He could shift from studied courtesy to savage cruelty within the space of a breath. The officers who served him, even the most capable ones, carried a constant awareness that a single misstep, one miscalculation in a briefing, could end in arrest or worse. The purges had burned that awareness deep into the officer corps. Men watched their words. They calculated every inflection. They lived with the knowledge that yesterday's favor could become today's condemnation without warning or reason. Antonov seemed somehow immune to this, though perhaps that immunity was more about his temperament than any special protection. He did not raise his voice in meetings. He did not seek to dominate conversations. When he presented plans or corrected assumptions, he did so with a quiet certainty that seemed to frustrate rather than offend. There was something almost disarming about his refusal to perform authority. Stalin, accustomed to men who fought for his attention and approval, appeared to have developed a different kind of regard for an officer who simply laid out the facts and let the work speak for itself. One recurring detail from those who witnessed their encounters suggests something particular about how Antonov managed in Stalin's presence. When the dictator would demand explanations or challenge operational decisions, Antonov would respond with detail and precision rather than defensiveness. He would produce maps. He would cite distances, supply calculations, the disposition of reserves. He spoke the language of logistics and organization, subjects that were fundamentally mathematical rather than ideological. There was something about this approach that seemed to satisfy Stalin's need for rational justification, even when he ultimately chose to ignore it. The dictator had a particular mania for operational planning. During the war years, he became consumed with the movements of divisions and regiments, the positioning of artillery, the timing of offensives. He wanted to understand everything. He wanted to control everything. Antonov, by virtue of his position as chief of operations, and later as the man responsible for coordinating the general staff's work, became the vessel into which Stalin poured these obsessions. Hour after hour, the dictator would call him to the Kremlin, or speak with him by secure telephone, demanding briefings, questioning assumptions, sometimes suggesting operational alternatives that ranged from the merely risky to the strategically unsound. What allowed Antonov to survive this constant pressure, according to those who knew him, was a kind of professional composure that never quite became coldness. He would present Stalin's suggestions back to him in the morning with implementation plans, sometimes managing to subtly reformulate them into something more strategically sound. He disagreed when necessary, but he did so calmly and with evidence, not with heat. If Stalin overruled him, and Stalin frequently did, Antonov would accept it without visible resentment and move immediately to the practical problem of making the worst possible plan work, as well as circumstances allowed. There was also, one suspects, something in Antonov's background that made him less threatening than other officers. He came from the old imperial service, not the communist underground. He had no powerful faction backing him, no party connections that might make him a rival. He had survived the purges through obscurity and competence, not through political maneuvering. In a way, he represented no challenge to Stalin's authority. He was purely an instrument, and Stalin, once he recognized this, could employ him without the constant suspicion that otherwise poisoned his relationships with more ambitious men. The dictator's demanding nature was never, during these encounters, directed at Antonov in quite the same manner as it was toward others. Stalin might rage at Vasilevsky for a perceived failure on a front. He might erupt at Zhukov for exceeding his authority, or showing insufficient gratitude. But with Antonov, there seemed to be a different register. The demands were relentless, certainly, but they felt more like the demands of a man conferring with a trusted technical expert than a tyrant intimidating a subordinate. This distinction, subtle though it might be, was perhaps the core of their relationship. One might wonder, in the long hours of night when such questions naturally arise, what Antonov felt about this trust. Did he experience it as a burden, as a kind of protection, as a responsibility that kept him awake? The historical record offers few glimpses into his inner life. He left no diaries, no memoirs of consequence. What remains is mostly operational record and the brief recollections of colleagues, fragments that suggest a man who had learned, at some point early in his career, that the surest way to survive in such circumstances was to become indispensable without becoming visible. The loneliness of his position, one imagines, must have been profound. Antonov could not share the weight of what he carried with anyone. His direct superiors, Vasilevsky, and eventually the broader general staff structure, knew his competence, but could not truly know his mind. His subordinates saw only the officer who appeared in the early morning and remained until late evening, reviewing maps, checking calculations, speaking in quiet tones about supply lines and unit dispositions. Stalin alone understood the full scope of what he was doing, but Stalin's understanding was always filtered through the lens of his own needs and anxieties. There was perhaps an implicit bargain at work here, though bargains with Stalin were always precarious things. Antonov would provide unwavering competence and complete absence of political ambition. He would tell Stalin what he needed to know, when he needed to know it, and he would never seek credit for the victories that resulted. In return, he would be allowed to live, to work, and to exercise his considerable talents without the constant threat of denunciation or arrest that hung over so many others. It was not friendship, certainly, but it was something approaching respect, which in Stalin's Moscow was perhaps the rarest and most valuable currency of all. By the summer of 1943, the war in the East had shifted into a strange new rhythm, one that bore little resemblance to the desperate retreats and counterattacks of the previous years. The Germans, having learned hard lessons at Stalingrad, were no longer launching vast offensives with the confidence of 1941 and 1942. Instead, they were gathering their strength for what would be a massive, carefully prepared strike in the Kursk region, a place where the front lines had formed what military men called a bulge or salient, a deep Soviet-controlled pocket jutting into German-held territory. The Germans saw an opportunity there. Antonov, now settled firmly into the operational planning sections of the General Staff in Moscow, saw something different entirely. What made Kursk remarkable, and what made the preparations for that battle a window into how Antonov's mind worked, was that the Soviets knew almost everything about German intentions before the offensive began. Intelligence had penetrated German High Command's planning so thoroughly, through sources that included the Swiss intelligence service, Soviet agents in Berlin, and intercepted radio transmissions, that Stalin and his commanders possessed something almost unprecedented in warfare, near-perfect foreknowledge of an enemy's grand strategy. This created an extraordinary opportunity for precise, methodical planning, not the kind of improvisation and desperate reaction that had defined Soviet operations in 1941 and 1942, but rather something that required the kind of cold, mathematical thinking that Antonov had been quietly perfecting for decades. In the weeks leading up to the offensive, while generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky carried the political weight and made the presentations to Stalin, it was Antonov who worked through the intricate mathematics of the thing. How many divisions would be needed, where they should be positioned, how supplies should flow, what reserves should be held, when forces should be committed. The calculation was immense and delicate. It was not about daring maneuvers or intuitive leaps. It was about proportion, about balance, about making sure that every piece of the Soviet response fitted precisely into its place on the map, and that when the pieces moved, they moved in coordination rather than chaos. Antonov's approach to Kursk was characteristic of something that had become increasingly clear about him. He thought like someone who had spent years studying railroads and supply lines, not like a cavalry officer dreaming of breakthrough. He understood that a modern battle was not won by the general who had the brightest idea, but by the general staff that could move the most supplies to the right place at the right time, and then organize hundreds of thousands of men to use those supplies effectively. The Kursk offensive, from a planning perspective, was essentially a massive logistics puzzle with a military solution embedded within it. The Soviet defensive preparations, and it was as a defense that Antonov and his colleagues chose to treat the battle, which was itself a bold strategic decision, involved creating multiple layers of defensive positions. Imagine concentric rings, one behind another, each thickened with anti-tank guns, mines, and infantry. Each ring was designed to absorb and slow a German attack, to force the Germans to commit more forces, to stretch their supply lines, to wear down their momentum. This was not inspired by any particular stroke of genius in Antonov's mind. Rather, it was the logical conclusion of careful analysis. The Soviets had the defensive terrain, the numerical superiority, and time on their side. Why not use those advantages methodically, rather than seeking some dramatic counteroffensive? What is perhaps worth noting, though always with the gentleness that comes from historical distance, is that Antonov's fingerprints on these decisions are difficult to distinguish from Zhukov's and Vasilevsky's. The historical record attributes the broad outlines of the Kursk strategy to Zhukov particularly, yet in the surviving accounts and memoirs, Antonov is always there in the background, working through the details that made the strategy possible. Did he propose the defensive strategy? The documents do not quite say, did he shape it once it was proposed? Almost certainly. Did he bear some of the burden of making sure that when the strategy was decided upon, it could actually be executed by flesh and blood and steel? Almost certainly that as well. One aspect of Antonov's contribution to Kursk that emerges from the archival accounts is his insistence on coordination between the different Soviet fronts. The front, in Soviet military terminology, was something like an army group in German or Western terms, a massive formation containing multiple armies. Around Kursk, the Soviets had arrayed several fronts. For a plan to work at that scale, those fronts could not operate independently. They had to be synchronized. They had to know what the other was doing. They had to be able to shift forces and respond to developments as a unified whole rather than as separate commands. This kind of synchronization does not happen by accident. It requires an officer at the center, at the General Staff headquarters in Moscow, who understands the entire picture and who can communicate, adjust, and direct. This was exactly the kind of work that filled Antonov's days in that map-filled room near the Kremlin. When the German offensive began on July 5, 1943, Soviet intelligence had prepared the ground so thoroughly that the Germans achieved almost complete surprise in their tactical execution, yet no surprise whatsoever in their strategic concept. The Soviets were ready. They had absorbed the German assault into their prepared positions. They had held their reserves, and then, according to the plan that Antonov and his colleagues had worked through in such meticulous detail, they had launched their own offensives in other sectors of the front, offensives that the Germans could not counter because they had committed so much of their strength to Kursk. The result was a Soviet victory, though victory at Kursk was not quite the same as victory at Stalingrad. There was no dramatic encirclement, no destruction of an entire German army group. Instead, there was the gradual, methodical wearing down of German strength, the retention of initiative by the Soviets, and the opening of opportunities for further Soviet advances. Some historians have questioned whether the battle was as decisive as Soviet accounts claimed. Others have suggested that the real genius lay more with Zhukov's aggressive instincts than with Antonov's careful planning. These are fair debates. What seems clear, however, is that in a battle that required the kind of detailed orchestration and precision that modern warfare was increasingly demanding, Antonov's quiet contribution proved essential. He was the man in the background making sure that the orchestra stayed in time. He was the one checking the maps at 3 in the morning, verifying that divisions would arrive where they were supposed to arrive, that ammunition would flow where it was supposed to flow, that the massive machine of the Soviet military could function as a coordinated whole rather than as separate parts grinding against each other. In many ways, Kursk marked a turning point in how the war was won. It was no longer primarily a matter of who could produce the most passionate combat troops or who had the most aggressive generals. It was increasingly a matter of who could organize and coordinate vast resources most effectively. The Germans, for all their military tradition and tactical skill, were fighting an enemy that was learning to master this new kind of warfare, and at the heart of that learning, often working in obscurity, was a man named Antonov, whose greatest victories were not won on any battlefield, but rather in the careful calculations performed in a quiet office far from the sound of guns. While Zhukov commanded in the field, and Vasilevsky moved between the fronts with the authority of Stalin's chosen lieutenant, it was Antonov who sat in the General Staff building and held all the threads. The maps on his walls grew larger and more complex as the war deepened, covering not just sectors, but entire theaters, entire nations. One map alone might show the positions of 5 or 6 Soviet fronts simultaneously, each one a massive army group numbering in the hundreds of thousands, each requiring food, ammunition, replacement soldiers, fuel for tanks, spare parts for vehicles, horses for supply lines, still essential even in the age of mechanization. The logistics of coordinating such movement across a continent was a mathematics of human suffering and material exhaustion that only a few minds could hold entire in consciousness. Antonov was one of them. The General Staff, in its essence, was a vast and anxious nerve center. The building itself became quieter as night fell, but it never truly slept. Telephone lines connected it to every front command, every army headquarters, every corps in the field. The conversations that moved along those lines, some heated, some urgent, some barely restrained panic disguised in professional terminology, all flowed eventually to the chief of operations, or someone working directly beneath him. What happens when a front commander reports that his left flank is collapsing? What happens when 2 separate army groups are pushing toward the same territory and need clear orders about who moves where? What happens when supplies fall short and someone must decide whether the armor gets fuel or the infantry gets ammunition? These were the questions that shaped the daily existence of the General Staff, and Antonov had become the man who could answer them without visible emotion, with only calculation and experience. His role, distinct from but deeply intertwined with Zhukov's, becomes clearer when we imagine the actual mechanics of a major Soviet operation. Zhukov might be at the front with a small retinue, speaking directly to the commanders of multiple fronts, understanding the tactical situation from conversations and reconnaissance reports. He could see the human beings in command, read their confidence or doubt in their faces. But Zhukov could not be everywhere at once, and he could not simultaneously track the logistical impossibilities that were multiplying across thousands of kilometers. Antonov, by contrast, existed in a space of pure information synthesis. He studied maps until he could visualize terrain he had never seen. He absorbed reports until he understood not just what was happening, but what would likely happen next. He became, in a very real sense, a man who knew the Soviet army better than any single commander in any single moment could know it, because he held the totality of its distribution, its strength, its weaknesses, all at once. Consider the mechanics of launching a major coordinated assault across multiple fronts. Perhaps 3 separate front commands need to attack simultaneously, each from a different direction, against the same enemy position or region. The timing must be exact, or the attacks will not reinforce each other, but instead occur in isolation, allowing the enemy to concentrate against them one at a time. The supply schedules must synchronize. Ammunition convoys, fuel trucks, fresh troops arriving at specific moments to relieve exhausted units. Artillery barrages must begin and end on precise schedules so that advancing infantry is not caught beneath friendly fire. Air support must be available when needed. Medical evacuation lines must be prepared in advance. The complexity of these dependencies is almost dizzying when spelled out plainly. Yet it must all occur across hundreds of kilometers of muddy terrain, in the grip of winter or the chaos of spring thaw, under constant enemy pressure and with equipment that breaks down, commanders who become exhausted or panicked, and soldiers who run out of food or ammunition or hope. This is where Antonov's gift became most evident. He could hold these systems in his mind and adjust them. When one element was delayed, he could calculate the cascade of consequences and propose solutions before the delay became catastrophic. When a commander proposed a maneuver that looked tactically brilliant but was logistically impossible, Antonov could explain with quiet authority why the maneuver could not happen and what alternatives existed within the real constraints of the physical world. He did not do this by telling commanders they were fools. Rather, he presented them with facts. Here is what is available. Here is what it takes to feed and move an army this size. Here is what we can actually accomplish, given the time remaining and the resources at hand. Gradually, through careful, almost painstaking work, he became the man that every major operation had to pass through before it could be approved. The relationship between Antonov and Zhukov is one of the quieter mysteries of Soviet command during the war. Zhukov was the celebrity general, the man whose voice carried authority, whose confidence bordered on arrogance, whose presence could soothe Stalin's anxieties or aggravate them depending on the moment. Zhukov was visible, memorable, a figure who appeared in photographs in the Soviet press, whose name was whispered with respect or fear across the officer corps. Antonov, by contrast, remained nearly invisible. Yet when historians have studied the actual planning of Soviet operations, when they have examined the written records, the orders, the coordination problems that arose and were solved, Antonov's fingerprints are evident everywhere. His calm, methodical approach to solving the unsolvable problems of logistics and coordination left traces in the way operations actually unfolded. He was the architect of possibility. One might wonder whether Zhukov's confidence in major operations was partly confidence in Antonov's meticulous preparation behind the scenes. When Zhukov proposed a bold maneuver, was he confident because he was reckless, or because Antonov had assured him that the supply lines could sustain it, that the timing would work, that the enormous moving parts could be orchestrated without the entire enterprise collapsing into chaos? It is difficult to say with certainty, but the speculation is reasonable. Zhukov's successes, however brilliant his tactical insights, depended on infrastructure, and Antonov was the man who understood Soviet military infrastructure with an almost supernatural clarity. He was the institutional memory, the living embodiment of what could and could not be done. The role of the General Staff itself deserves a moment of quiet reflection. In the military structures of many nations, the General Staff serves a support function. It processes information, it makes recommendations, but power and prestige flow primarily to field commanders. In the Soviet system, particularly under Stalin, and particularly during the exigencies of total war, the General Staff had become something closer to a command center, a place where decisions about the entire war effort were actually made, or at least where they were prepared for Stalin's final approval. The Chief of Operations, or whoever held Antonov's position, was therefore not merely an administrator, but a central figure in the machinery of war. And yet Antonov bore this authority without ever seeming to seek it, without ever making it visible to the outside world. He was a general who never gave speeches, never appeared at public functions, never allowed his name to be mentioned in Soviet newspapers unless absolutely necessary. He simply did the work, day after day, night after night, surrounded by maps and telephones and young staff officers who were too exhausted to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they were helping to coordinate. The quiet architecture that Antonov embodied became increasingly essential as the war deepened and the Soviet operations grew larger, more ambitious, more demanding. The days when Soviet tactics consisted primarily of mass frontal assaults, of overwhelming enemy positions through sheer weight of numbers, had given way to something more sophisticated. The Soviets were learning, from hard experience and from the necessity of managing their own suffering, how to use space and time and logistics as weapons as sophisticated as any tank or artillery piece. Antonov understood this evolution in his bones. He had lived through years of studying staff work, of learning how to translate abstract military theory into actual movements of men and machines. Now, finally, in the heart of the greatest war in history, that accumulated understanding was finding its purpose. There exists a peculiar loneliness at the heart of war that few soldiers on the front ever truly understand. The loneliness not of danger, but of total awareness. To stand in a map room somewhere in Moscow, to hold in your hands the knowledge of where 50 divisions lie, what supplies they lack, where the Germans are likely to strike in 3 weeks' time, is to carry a weight that cannot be shared with a comrade in the trench beside you. Antonov knew this weight, perhaps more intimately than any man in the Soviet Union during those grinding years. The maps covering the walls of the General Staff headquarters were not merely diagrams. They were, in a profound sense, a kind of solitary mirror in which Antonov saw the entire war reflected back at him, not as glory, not as heroism, but as logistics, as mathematics, as thousands of small decisions cascading into events that would reshape the face of Europe. When a front commander in the field lost contact with his headquarters, it was Antonov who sat in candle-lit silence, reconstructing what had happened from fragmentary radio signals and messenger reports. When ammunition shipments failed to arrive at a crucial moment, when railway lines froze or broke under German bombing, when the weather turned mud into impassable swamp, these were not abstract problems to be discussed in a report. They were the lived reality of men he would never meet, and yet upon whose survival his calculations entirely depended. The telephone became his only companion in the deepest hours of night. The lines connected him to front commanders across 1,000 miles of territory, crackling and uncertain, sometimes cut by German saboteurs or overwhelmed by the sheer volume of simultaneous transmissions. Antonov would sit with the receiver pressed to his ear, his pencil moving across paper in precise, unhurried strokes, documenting supply requests that had to be converted instantly into railway manifests, into truck convoys, into the precise moment when food and ammunition and fuel would arrive at a specific map grid. One can imagine the strange intimacy of these conversations, the voice of a distant general, perhaps frightened, perhaps angry, reaching Antonov across the void of winter and distance, and Antonov responding with that same measured calm, that same certainty that carried no false comfort, only the assurance that he understood, that he was listening, that the problem was being held in his mind as seriously as the general held it in the mud. There is a particular form of isolation that comes from being right. The men who command armies receive accolades, statues, commemorations. They stand before crowds and are cheered. But the man who sees what must happen before it happens, who knows the shape of events 3 weeks in advance because he has calculated every variable, he stands alone with that knowledge. If his calculations are correct, others will receive the credit. Historians will write of a brilliant maneuver, a stroke of tactical genius, when what they are actually describing is Antonov's quiet foresight made manifest. If he is wrong, only he will know why, only he will replay the moment in his mind, asking himself whether the error lay in a misread of German intentions, or in some failure of logistical imagination, or in a supply route cut by chance rather than by any law of war. The human mind was not designed to hold such burdens alone. It was not designed to spend 8, 10, sometimes 16 hours a day bent over maps, calculating movements, imagining scenarios, living in a perpetual state of contingency planning. Antonov's face, in the few photographs that survive, shows the marks of this peculiar strain. The eyes do not look away, even in repose. The jaw has a tautness to it, as though the body itself has learned to resist some perpetual tension. One wonders what Antonov dreamed of on the rare nights he managed to sleep. Did he dream of maps that rearranged themselves, of numbers that would not balance, of telephone conversations that could not be concluded? Or did his exhausted mind simply shut down, retreating into blankness, before rising again at dawn to resume the same eternal calculations? The isolation had another dimension to it as well. Antonov was not a man who sought personal glory. By all accounts, and here we must acknowledge that firm accounts are scarce, for he left few letters, few memoirs, few recorded reflections. He seemed genuinely indifferent to recognition. This was almost certainly not modesty in the conventional sense, but rather a form of psychological necessity. A staff officer who requires recognition cannot maintain the discipline that staff work demands. The moment one begins calculating how an action might appear to history, the calculations become corrupted. Antonov seemed to understand this instinctively. He cultivated a kind of invisible presence, moving through the military bureaucracy, not as a man seeking advancement, but as a vessel through which problems were solved and decisions were made. Yet this very indifference to recognition created another subtle form of loneliness. He was close to Stalin, closer perhaps than any general of the war, and yet he could never truly know whether that closeness was genuine or merely instrumental. Stalin did not have friends. He had tools that worked. Antonov was the finest tool at Stalin's disposal, and so he was brought into the inner councils, consulted on matters of supreme importance, trusted with information that many marshals never accessed. But what does it mean to be trusted by a man who trusts no one? What does it mean to be drawn close by a dictator, knowing that proximity itself is dangerous, that today's confidence can transform overnight into tomorrow's suspicion? Antonov navigated this impossible terrain by remaining, as far as is possible, a non-person. He did not ingratiate himself. He did not cultivate patrons or networks of influence. He simply performed the work with such evident competence that any failure would have been obviously attributable to others, and any success inextricably bound to his own judgment. The price of this was profound solitude, not the solitude of the man without friends. Antonov had colleagues, men who respected him, but the solitude of the man whose inner life is almost wholly unknown. He kept his own counsel. He did not participate in the gossip and jockeying that occupied the rest of the officer corps. Even as the war progressed and his influence grew, even as younger officers began to understand that Antonov's approval mattered more than rank or connections, he maintained this curious distance. Perhaps this distance was the only way he could survive. Perhaps it was the price he had already decided to pay for staying alive through the purges, for remaining productive through the catastrophes of 1941 and 1942, for ultimately shaping the arc of the war itself. Behind a desk, surrounded by maps and telephones and the constant flow of reports, Antonov lived through every day of the war with a peculiar hyper-awareness. He saw things at a scale that the battlefield commander, for all his courage, could never access. He saw the war as a whole, as an interconnected system of logistics and timing and human capacity stretched to its absolute limit. But this total vision came at a cost. It meant that he could never lose himself in the simplicity of a single tactical problem. He could never take a day off from the war. Even when he slept, the maps remained behind his eyes. The calculations continued in his dreams. The weight of decisions not yet made pressed down on his chest. This is perhaps the deepest isolation of the staff officer. Not that he is alone, but that he is never, for a single moment of the war, relieved of the burden of knowing too much. In the spring of 1944, as the European continent lay pinned beneath the weight of two great armies, the Soviet General Staff was already thinking far beyond the immediate horizon. Winter had passed. The mud of the Rasputitsa, that season of endless rain that transforms Russian earth into an impassable grey ocean, was retreating northward. And in the planning rooms of Moscow, where Antonov moved between desks laden with situation maps and coded telegraph flimsy, a new operation was taking shape, an operation so vast in its ambition that it would dwarf even the victories that had come before. Operation Bagration, the name itself, given to honor the Russian general who had fought Napoleon, carried a symbolic weight, but the scale of what Antonov was coordinating from behind those silent maps was no longer merely symbolic. This would be the encirclement and annihilation of German Army Group Center, the last great concentration of Wehrmacht strength in the Eastern Theater, and it would unfold across the flat, forest-ridden expanse of Belarus. a land where armies could move in ways that seemed almost impossible to those accustomed to the constrained terrain of Western Europe. The planning had begun months earlier. Antonov, working closely with Zhukov and Vasilevsky, had to envision not one battle, but a symphony of movements orchestrated across a front that stretched, at points, for more than 1,000 kilometers. How does one hold such scale in the mind? The answer lay in the same qualities that had brought Antonov through a decade of warfare: methodical attention, the ability to think in layers, and a capacity to remain calm when complexity threatened to overwhelm. The operation itself was conceived around a central principle of Soviet operational art that Antonov had come to embody. The Germans held a position, a salient pushing eastward into Soviet territory. The conventional temptation would be to attack it directly, frontally, grinding away until superior numbers prevailed. But Antonov and the other planners had learned, through costly experience, that such approaches were wasteful of lives and time. Instead, they would attack not where the Germans expected, but on either flank. Multiple Soviet fronts would drive inward and forward, each movement calculated to cut off the German army's retreat routes while simultaneously pounding it from the sides and rear. It was encirclement on a continental scale. Picture him, in those weeks before the offensive, Antonov sitting with a narrow circle of staff officers in a room where the walls were papered with maps. The maps showed not the present configuration of forces, but the projected positions 3 weeks hence, a month hence, envisioning the precise moment when German formations would find themselves surrounded, their escape routes closed. This was not prophecy, it was calculation. It was the accumulated knowledge of 4 years of war, translated into lines drawn on acetate sheets and held up to the light. The logistical requirements alone were staggering. To move the troops, artillery, ammunition, fuel, and supplies necessary to execute Bagration meant coordinating thousands upon thousands of transport vehicles, railway lines that had to be rebuilt as Soviet forces advanced, and supply depots that had to materialize almost as if by magic in the wilderness of Belarus. Antonov's work touched every aspect of this machine, not in the sense that he personally directed each truck or laid each rail, that was the work of subordinate commanders and logistics officers, but in the sense that the entire operation flowed from the framework he had helped construct. A fascinating question emerges here. How much of the success of an operation belongs to the man who conceives it at the strategic and operational level, and how much belongs to the soldiers who execute it on the ground? There is no clear answer, only a recognition that both are necessary, and that the mind which can hold the entire apparatus in view is as rare as the courage required to charge through fire. When the offensive opened in late June 1944, something remarkable happened. The German forces, which had been expecting a major Soviet thrust to occur further north, near Leningrad, found themselves instead assailed from multiple directions simultaneously. The weight of Soviet offensives in the center and south began to crack the German position, like pressure applied to an eggshell. Army Group Center, caught off balance, began to fracture. And here is where Antonov's meticulous planning revealed its truest value. Because the operation had been conceived with such precision, because each element had been thought through and coordinated, the Soviet formations knew what was expected of them. When opportunities arose, moments when German positions crumbled faster than anticipated, the system was flexible enough to exploit them without requiring constant recalibration from Moscow. The orders had been given, the framework existed, now it was a matter of execution. The encirclement tightened slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, Soviet spearhead units drove forward, racing to cut the roads that led westward from Belarus toward the Polish border. The German forces found themselves increasingly compressed, increasingly desperate. What should have been orderly withdrawals became chaotic flights. The very scale of the Soviet advance, armies moving forward at speeds that seemed impossible given the terrain and the season, began to overwhelm German ability to respond. Antonov, during these weeks, would have received reports flowing in from the fronts. Telegraph messages that arrived in bursts, sometimes contradictory or delayed. The reality at the front was always messier than the maps suggested. Units suffered greater losses than anticipated. Breakthrough attempts failed on the first try, requiring reinforcement and renewed effort. Weather intervened. The fog of war, thick and persistent, clouded every command decision, yet throughout all of this, the basic plan held. The envelopment continued. The German forces were being slowly compressed into a progressively smaller pocket. By late July, the pocket had begun to close. German forces that had been retreating eastward, seeking to escape the Soviet columns driving from north and south, found themselves suddenly cut off. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, realizing they were surrounded, attempted desperate breakouts. Some succeeded in fragmentary groups, many did not. The scale of the German catastrophe was almost unfathomable. In the aftermath, the numbers became available. Army Group Center, which had entered the operation with approximately 800,000 men, had suffered somewhere near 400,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. It was perhaps the single greatest defeat the Wehrmacht would suffer on the Eastern Front, worse even than Stalingrad in some measures, because it represented not the loss of one city, but the effective destruction of an entire army group. The formations that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, that had come within sight of Moscow, were no longer a coherent fighting force. And yet Antonov's name would barely appear in the Soviet accounts of the victory. The glory was claimed by the front commanders, by Zhukov, whose name had become synonymous with Soviet victory, by the generals whose faces appeared in newspapers. Antonov remained in Moscow, in the General Staff building where the windows looked out upon a city that was slowly returning to normal life. The operation had been conceived in those rooms, guided by the information that flowed in and out, adjusted as new intelligence arrived. But none of this could be photographed. None of it could be easily explained to a population hungry for heroes. Perhaps there is a loneliness in that. The loneliness of a man who has shaped events of continental significance, yet who will never be able to point to the moment of his triumph in the way that a commander can describe a charge, a breakthrough, a final victory in battle. What does it mean to win in this way? What satisfaction comes from knowing that the structure you built from maps and calculations functioned as intended, even if your own role in that functioning will remain largely invisible to history? Yet this invisibility, this quiet orchestration of vast forces, was perhaps Antonov's truest contribution to Soviet victory. In an age of personality cults and propaganda, when Soviet generals were elevated to near-mythic status by a regime that needed heroes, Antonov existed in a different sphere altogether. He was trusted not because he was famous, but because he worked. His value lay not in his name or his face, but in his capacity to take an enormous complexity and render it manageable, to take the ambitions of Stalin and the military realities of the front and forge from them a plan that could actually succeed. By early 1945, the map of Europe was being redrawn in shades of advancing red. The German armies had retreated across the Vistula. Soviet forces were massing on the borders of Poland, preparing for the final push westward toward Berlin itself. And in the modest offices of the General Staff building in Moscow, where Antonov had worked in quiet efficiency for the better part of 4 years, something quiet and significant was about to happen. Stalin, the man who had orchestrated the deaths of nearly every general officer of his own making, would make a decision that spoke volumes about the nature of military competence in the Soviet state. He would elevate Aleksei Antonov, not to the glittering rank of marshal, which would have been the obvious choice, but to something perhaps more intimate and more revealing of his true worth. In February of that year, as snow fell over the Soviet capital, Antonov was formally appointed Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. It was not the appointment of a publicity figure or a political ally. It was not even, in the strictest sense, a promotion laden with ceremony or public celebration. It was, rather, an acknowledgement. A quiet official recognition that the man who had spent the war in the shadows of map rooms and strategic telephone lines was now the supreme coordinator of Soviet military operations. In the Tsarist era, and indeed in the early Soviet years, the Chief of Staff had been a role of considerable prestige and formal authority. By 1945, in the brutal meritocracy that war had imposed upon Stalin's regime, it had become something else entirely. The most exhausting, most consequential, most unforgiving position in the entire military apparatus. To be Chief of the General Staff was to be Stalin's right hand in matters of war. It was to live with the knowledge that errors in judgment, miscalculations in the coordination of millions of soldiers, or failures in the synchronization of vast operations could result not only in military defeat, but in personal destruction. And yet Antonov accepted the role without hesitation, because by this point in the war, he understood what it truly meant to serve in such a position. He had already been functioning as the operational brain of Soviet military planning for months, perhaps years. The formal title was merely documentation of what everyone in the upper echelons of the military already knew. What made this appointment remarkable, however, was not what it elevated, but what it represented about the nature of Stalin's judgment. Here was a man, Antonov, who had never cultivated political connections with the ruthless efficiency of a Zhukov or a Malenkov. He was not a party favorite. He had no network of political allies waiting in the wings. He was not a public figure. Photographs of him were few and far between. He rarely appeared at official functions. He was not, by any measure, a man groomed for prominence through the traditional channels of Soviet power, and yet Stalin chose him. Or perhaps, more accurately, the ruthless logic of military necessity had chosen him, and Stalin had been wise enough to recognize and formalize that choice. What this suggests, if we allow ourselves to speculate gently, is that even Stalin understood the distinction between political usefulness and practical competence. Even a dictator, when faced with the existential challenge of prosecuting a continental war, occasionally arrives at the conclusion that results matter more than loyalty, that skill matters more than ideology, that the quiet man at the desk who knows how to move armies matters more than the shouting general with connections. Antonov's appointment in 1945 represented something that was becoming increasingly rare in the Soviet system, the elevation of a man based almost exclusively on what he could do, not on who he knew or what he represented. He was not Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who carried both military authority and a certain theatrical presence. He was not General Alexander Vasilevsky, who had his own carefully cultivated relationship with Stalin's inner circle. He was Aleksei Antonov, and what he brought to the role was precision, exhaustion, and an almost monastic devotion to the orchestration of military operations at the highest level. The significance of this appointment extended beyond mere personnel reshuffling. In naming Antonov Chief of the General Staff in 1945, Stalin was, in effect, institutionalizing the primacy of operations over politics in the conduct of the final phase of the European war. The campaigns that were about to unfold, the drive through Poland, the encirclement of German forces in the east, the final assault on Berlin itself, would be coordinated not by a general who had gained his position through cunning or connection, but by one who had gained it through demonstrated, consistent, undeniable competence. This arrangement, while it lasted, would work. Antonov would coordinate operations across multiple fronts with a clarity and precision that spoke to his years of preparation, to the thousands of nights spent bent over maps, to the countless teleconferences where he had learned to speak in the compressed language of military operations, saying in 5 words what other men took 15 to express. Consider the alternative path that Antonov's career might have taken. A man with his talents and his discretion could have attempted to leverage his skills for political advancement. He could have cultivated allies, accumulated favors, built networks of obligation. Instead, he had chosen the path of the specialist, the technician, the man content to let his work speak for itself. By 1945, that choice, that quiet, consistent refusal to blur the lines between military expertise and political maneuvering, had resulted in the highest operational post in the Soviet military apparatus. It was not, perhaps, the most glamorous path to power, but it was, in its own way, the most authentic. There was an irony in this, gentle though it may be to state, in a totalitarian system where political considerations contaminated nearly every aspect of military life, the path to supreme operational authority had been achieved by a man who largely ignored political considerations altogether. Antonov had succeeded, it might be argued, precisely because he had never tried to succeed in the conventional sense. He had focused on being exceptionally good at what he did, and that exceptional competence had become, in time, indispensable. And so when Stalin made Antonov chief of the General Staff in the early months of 1945, he was not rewarding a politician or a party loyalist. He was recognizing, formally and officially, what the conduct of the war had already proven, that the quiet man from Grodno, the boy who had learned map work in a military school, the officer who had accumulated decades of logistical and operational knowledge in obscurity, was the man most capable of coordinating the final destruction of Nazi Germany. It was an appointment that would last only a brief period. The war itself would end within months. But in those months, Antonov would have the opportunity to demonstrate, once more and for the last time in the European theatre, why Stalin had chosen him. The maps would need to be redrawn constantly. The fronts would need to be coordinated. The flow of supplies and reserves would need to be maintained. The decisions of the highest level would need to be translated into orders that would move millions of soldiers in synchronized precision. And all of that would fall to the chief of the General Staff, the man who had finally, after years of working in the shadows, stepped into the formal recognition of his role. By the winter of 1944, the maps across the General Staff building in Moscow had begun to show something that once seemed impossible. The Soviet frontier was no longer retreating toward Moscow, but pushing outward, westward, toward the very heart of European Germany itself. Antonov stood among those maps in the hours before dawn, his eyes tracking the thin red lines that represented advancing Soviet armies, lines that he and his staff had drawn with meticulous care, based on intelligence reports, supply calculations, and the accumulated knowledge of how many soldiers could move how many kilometers in how many days. The calculations were endless, and they consumed him entirely. The final campaigns of the war in Europe would become the stage upon which Antonov's greatest work would unfold, though few outside the walls of the General Staff would ever truly understand the scope of what he orchestrated. While the world would remember the names of the great commanders who led the fronts, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, it was Antonov whose hands moved across those maps in the darkened hours, synchronizing armies that numbered in the millions, ensuring that 3, sometimes 4 massive fronts advanced, according to a rhythm so precise that it appeared almost choreographed. And perhaps it was, in a way. Choreography is, after all, merely mathematics applied to human movement, and Antonov was a master of that mathematics. The push into Eastern Europe in late 1944 presented challenges of a different character than what had come before. The Red Army was no longer fighting on home soil, defending Moscow or Stalingrad with the desperation of those defending their own earth. Now the armies were moving through territory that was foreign, through nations that had been under German control for years, through populations that were often uncertain of what Soviet occupation would mean. Logistics became even more critical. Every kilometer westward meant supply lines that stretched longer, that became more fragile, that required constant attention to ensure that armies numbering hundreds of thousands did not simply grind to a halt from hunger or lack of ammunition. Antonov understood this in a way that only a man who had spent his entire career studying the mathematics of movement could understand it. The Warsaw Operation in January of 1945 stands as one moment where the clarity of Antonov's thinking becomes visible, even through the fog of history. The Soviet armies needed to cross the Vistula River, that great barrier that had stood between the advancing Soviets and the heart of Poland. The crossing had to be swift, but also coordinated with operations on both the northern and southern flanks. Too much haste and the armies would be stranded on the wrong side of the river, cut off from supplies. Too much caution and the momentum would be lost, and the Germans would have time to reorganize their crumbling defenses. Antonov balanced these pressures with a precision that came from decades of experience with problems that no textbook could fully solve. The armies crossed, the operation succeeded, and yet his name appears nowhere in the popular accounts of that crossing, for staff officers are the invisible architects of victory. It is perhaps worth pausing here to contemplate what it means to be a man who shapes history from a distance, who never fires a weapon in anger, who never experiences the cold or the mud or the smell of gunpowder, yet whose decisions determine whether thousands of men will live or die. Antonov must have felt this weight, though he rarely spoke of it. The telephones on his desk connected him to commanders in the field, men who reported back the costs of the operations he had planned, the casualties, the difficulties, the moments when his calculations met the stubborn reality of warfare and did not quite align. Perhaps he felt a kind of responsibility that was different from the responsibility felt by a field commander. For a field commander sees his soldiers' faces, hears their cries, witnesses the immediate consequence of his orders. But Antonov saw numbers. He saw lines on maps. He saw the mathematics of destruction applied from a distance, and that, perhaps, required a different kind of strength, a different kind of fortitude. The East Prussian campaign began in January and continued through the winter months, another operation where Antonov's hand guided the coordination between multiple fronts that were attacking the German homeland itself. The Oder-Neisse operation followed, and then, as winter faded into the early months of 1945, the Great Convergence began, the Soviet armies circling around toward Berlin, tightening their encirclement like fingers closing slowly into a fist. Stalin wanted Berlin. He wanted the symbolic victory of capturing the German capital before the American and British armies could reach it from the west. But Berlin was not simply a target to be overrun. It was a heavily fortified city, the seat of Hitler's power, surrounded by defensive positions that had been prepared throughout the preceding months. The approach to Berlin required coordination on a scale that perhaps no general in the history of warfare had previously managed. Antonov understood that Berlin would be the climax of everything that had come before. All the vast movements of armies, all the intricate logistics, all the careful coordination of fronts. It had been leading toward this moment, toward the destruction of Nazi Germany in its own capital city. The planning for the Berlin operation was conducted in those final weeks of the war, with an intensity that perhaps even exceeded the preparation for the great offensives of 1943. Stalin visited the General Staff building more frequently. He wanted assurances that the operation would succeed, that Berlin would fall to Soviet forces, that the victory would be absolute. Antonov provided those assurances because he had done the calculations, studied the strengths and weaknesses of the German defenses, examined every variable that could be controlled or predicted. The confidence he expressed was not arrogance. It was the confidence of a man who knew his craft thoroughly. The actual assault on Berlin began in the middle of April 1945, and it was perhaps the most intense and brutal urban warfare of the entire European campaign. Antonov watched from Moscow as the reports came in, as the maps were updated, as the Soviet armies slowly, methodically pushed deeper into the city, crushing German resistance block by block, building by building. The operation was not perfectly executed. Warfare never is. There were moments of confusion, moments where coordination broke down, moments where the fog of battle obscured the clarity of the plans that had been so carefully drawn on the maps in the General Staff headquarters. But despite these inevitable frictions, the plan held. The armies advanced. Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany, was being systematically dismantled by forces that had been choreographed from Moscow by a man whose face few people knew, whose voice was rarely raised in anger, whose greatest talent was simply understanding how to move millions of people across vast distances with precision and purpose. By late April, it was clear that the end was near. Hitler took his own life in his bunker. The German forces in Berlin began to disintegrate. On the 2nd of May, 1945, Berlin fell to Soviet forces. The swastika that had flown over the city for more than a decade was pulled down. A different flag rose in its place. Antonov received the reports with the same calm demeanor that he had brought to every other moment of the war. He had not been present in Berlin. He would not see the destruction himself. But he had guided the forces that created it, had coordinated the movements of millions of men to achieve a result that was now historical fact. The war in Europe was nearly finished. Germany had been defeated. The Nazi regime that had launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union 4 years earlier had been utterly destroyed. What must it have felt like, one wonders, to understand that the great arc of your life's work was complete, that the vast structure you had helped to build, not a physical structure, but an organizational one, a structure of coordination and logistics and military planning, had accomplished its purpose. Antonov would have experienced it not as a moment of triumph, but perhaps as a moment of release, a settling of tension that had been sustained for so long that it had become the normal state of existence. The lights in the General Staff building would have burned a little less intensely in those final days of the war. The maps would have been updated for the last time. The war that had consumed so much of his attention, that had shaped the middle portion of his life, was moving toward conclusion. And though more work remained to be done, the great struggle of which he had been such a crucial, invisible part was nearing its end. And yet, one question lingers across the decades like smoke that refuses to clear, a mystery that historians still turn over in their minds as they sit with their archives and their tea growing cold. Why did Aleksei Antonov never become a marshal of the Soviet Union? Here was a man who had orchestrated the movements of millions, who had sat across from Stalin in the small hours of the morning and discussed operations that would determine the fate of nations. Yet when the war ended and the laurels were distributed, he remained a general, highly decorated, deeply respected, but never elevated to that highest title which his contemporaries wore. It is a peculiar absence, like noticing that a particular star is missing from the constellation you thought you knew completely. The puzzle becomes even more striking when you consider the marshals who were created. Zhukov, of course, had earned the title through his victories in the field, his aggressive tactics, and his visible command presence. Vasilevsky, Antonov's superior and closest collaborator, received his Marshal's Star in 1944, midway through the war itself, recognition of his genius at coordinating the great offensives. Konev was made a marshal. Rokossovsky was made a marshal. Even Tolbukin, who commanded impressive operations but never approached Antonov's breadth of strategic vision, eventually wore the red-bordered uniform. Yet Antonov, the quiet architect who had laid the groundwork for so many of these victories, was left standing at a slightly lower rank when the ceremonies concluded. Historians and military scholars have long proposed explanations for this peculiar fact, and it is worth moving slowly through them, understanding each as a piece of a puzzle that may never be entirely complete. The first and perhaps the most obvious theory concerns the very nature of Antonov's role itself. The chief of the General Staff, unlike a commander of a front or a field marshal, does not lead armies in the traditional sense. He does not ride forward with troops, does not make the dramatic cavalry charge, or stand resolute on a map table as shells fall around him. He works in the shadows and promotion systems, particularly in the Soviet Union, where spectacle and visibility held considerable weight, often honor the more visible sacrifice. A marshal's rank, historically, had belonged to those who commanded in the field, who won battles through their personal military genius and their willingness to stand in danger. Antonov's greatness lay in prediction rather than execution, in organization rather than confrontation. To elevate him to marshal's rank might have seemed to blur the boundaries of what a marshal's star actually represented in the Soviet military hierarchy. There exists, too, a question of political standing that historians approach with careful speculation. The Communist Party, even in the later years of the war, maintained a distinction between military officers who were trusted within the system and those who, however brilliant, remained somehow outside the party's deeper circles. Antonov was never a prominent figure in Bolshevik politics. He had no powerful patrons beyond Stalin himself, no political network that might have advocated for him in the party chambers where such honors were ultimately decided. His loyalty was to his craft, to precision and competence, rather than to ideology or party advancement. This distance from the party apparatus, while protecting him during the purges, may have also meant that his achievements lacked the political amplification they might have received had he possessed a stronger political voice. Zhukov, by contrast, had visibility, and, however careful he was to avoid appearing dangerous, he had a presence that could not be ignored. Antonov preferred to be ignored, which may have cost him dearly when the final honors were distributed. Some scholars have suggested, with considerable thoughtfulness, that Stalin himself may have deliberately refrained from elevating Antonov to marshal precisely because of their unique relationship. If such a theory holds weight, it would reflect Stalin's deeply suspicious nature. A man of lower rank, no matter how competent, remained somewhat dependent upon the dictator's favor. A man elevated to marshal, the highest military rank, might accumulate too much prestige, too much independent authority. Why hand a subordinate a symbol of power equal to your other generals, when his loyalty and obedience might be more assured if he remained technically subordinate to them? This is speculative ground, shadowed territory where we cannot know for certain what moved in Stalin's mind. But it is the kind of calculation that seemed to come naturally to him. He elevated Vasilevsky to marshal, it is true, but Vasilevsky was older, more senior, and perhaps less directly involved in the daily operations that the dictator micromanaged so obsessively. Antonov, by contrast, was the man Stalin spoke with daily, the man who could influence the course of operations in ways that no martial rank could ever do. Consider also the possibility, whispered rather than shouted among historians, that Antonov himself may have shown little interest in the honor. This suggestion sounds almost romantic in its simplicity, but those who knew him spoke of a man remarkably free from ambition for rank or recognition. His satisfaction seemed to come from the work itself, from the elegance of a well-executed plan, from the knowledge that he had contributed to something larger than himself. In a military culture saturated with the hunger for rank and position, such indifference would have been startling, perhaps even suspect. Yet it would explain a great deal. If Stalin had approached him with the offer of a marshal's star, and if Antonov had received it with polite demurral, showing more interest in whether the Stavka was functioning properly than in his own elevation, this would have been entirely consistent with everything we know of his character. The dictator was unaccustomed to men who did not grasp eagerly for power, and he might have respected such a display of disinterest, or, alternatively, felt oddly rebuffed by it. The end of the war itself may have played a role that is often overlooked. By 1945, Antonov's greatest utility to Stalin lay precisely in his role as the trusted organizer, the man behind the scenes who could coordinate a complex military structure. To make him a marshal at that moment, after the victory was essentially won, might have seemed less like a reward than like a ceremonial demotion, taking the man who was indispensable in his current role and moving him into a more ceremonial position. History does not record that Antonov was offered a marshal's post after the war and declined, but the timing alone may have made the offer unlikely. The war was won. The great strategic problems had been solved. What purpose would a new marshal serve? And perhaps there is a simpler explanation still, one that requires no speculation about Stalin's paranoia or Antonov's modesty: the sheer logistics of creating marshals in the Soviet system. There were only so many positions at that level, only so many opportunities for elevation. When the war ended, the party and the military made deliberate choices about who would be elevated and who would not. Antonov was already respected, already compensated with high rank and significant honors. He would remain chief of the general staff, a position of considerable authority and prestige. To make him a marshal might have meant displacing someone else, or creating a position without clear function. In bureaucracies, such calculations matter more than we often acknowledge. The puzzle remains, though, a man who shaped the course of modern warfare, who influenced decisions affecting the lives and deaths of millions, who earned the respect of his dictator and the gratitude of his nation, never received the final symbol of that achievement. It stands as a quiet reminder that history, in its recording and its honors, does not always align with the true distribution of influence and importance. The greatest architects of events sometimes remain unknown to those who simply read the headlines, unknown even to those who learned the names of the marshals in school. Antonov's absence from that golden list is not an oversight, not exactly, but rather a different kind of significance. The significance of a man who was too essential in his shadow to be moved into the light. When the war ended, when the guns fell silent across the ruins of Europe and the Soviet flag rose above the smoking Brandenburg Gate, Antonov stood at the apex of his power, yet found himself in a position that would have puzzled observers of Soviet military life. He was, by any measure, the chief architect of Soviet operational victory, the man who had quietly reshaped how the Red Army fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. The strategic mind that Stalin had come to depend upon in the final, crushing campaigns against Nazi Germany. And yet, as the victory parades began and the marshals were celebrated in the streets of Moscow, Antonov's name appeared less frequently in the official histories, less often in the photographs, less prominently in the grand narratives that the Soviet state was beginning to construct about its triumph. This was not, it seems, entirely a matter of accident or oversight. Antonov had never sought the spotlight that military fame could bring. He had spent the war years in the General Staff headquarters, in rooms filled with maps and telephones, in the careful choreography of logistics and supply lines, in the patient coordination of forces across vast distances. There was no romantic aura to that work, no moment of decisive cavalry charge, no photograph of a general pointing toward the horizon while troops surged forward. The work was precise, methodical, exhausting, and deeply unglamorous. And perhaps that very quality, that steadfast avoidance of theatrical display, made the transition from wartime to peacetime less jarring for a man like Antonov than it might have been for others. In the immediate aftermath of victory, as the Soviet Union turned its attention to the occupation of Eastern Germany and the consolidation of its influence across Eastern Europe, Antonov found himself taking on roles that reflected both his competence and his peculiar standing in the Soviet hierarchy. He was appointed deputy commander of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany, a position of considerable responsibility that required exactly the kind of organizational skill and calm judgment that he had honed across 4 years of total war. There was work to be done in that role, serious work, the coordination of military administration, the logistics of occupation forces, the careful management of displaced populations, and the infrastructure of a defeated nation. It was, in many ways, a seamless continuation of what he had been doing since 1941, though now the context had shifted from destruction to a kind of grim rebuilding. What must it have felt like, one might wonder, to walk through the cities and towns of occupied Germany in those early years after the war, to see the scale of what had been unleashed, the destruction that the Soviet forces, alongside the Allies, had inflicted upon the Nazi war machine. Antonov, a man of observation rather than assertion, would have understood at a profound level that he bore some measure of responsibility for that destruction. Not guilt, precisely, but a clear-eyed awareness that the plans he had drawn, the coordinations he had overseen, the movements he had calculated, had resulted in the deaths of millions. This is perhaps the deepest psychological burden of a staff officer, a weight that the public rarely considers when celebrating military victories. The person who draws the arrows on the map, who calculates the supply lines, who coordinates the movement of human beings as if they were units on a strategic diagram, must live with the knowledge of what those abstract symbols represent in human terms. And yet, the post-war years brought a new kind of visibility to military planning, a new urgency to Soviet defense strategy. The wartime alliance with the Western powers was fracturing almost as soon as the champagne had been finished and the victory parades had dispersed. The United States, it became clear, possessed a terrible new weapon, atomic weapons that would reshape the fundamental nature of military planning. The Soviet Union, though it had survived the greatest military catastrophe of the 20th century, now faced a new adversary, equipped with technologies that had no precedent. And this changing strategic landscape meant that men like Antonov, men who understood how to organize large-scale military operations, would be needed more than ever. In 1945, in the final weeks of the European War, Antonov had been promoted to the position of Chief of Staff of the Soviet Armed Forces, a role that placed him at the absolute center of Soviet military decision-making. But the Cold War that followed was a different kind of conflict entirely, one in which the traditional skills of operational planning, while still valuable, had to be integrated with new thinking about nuclear deterrence, about strategic bombing, about the very possibility that another great war might be fought with weapons so destructive that the old maps and supply lines and coordinated fronts might become obsolete. How does a military planner, a man trained in the careful orchestration of divisions and army groups, adapt his thinking to a world where the ultimate weapon might render all such careful planning moot? This was the question that haunted military thinkers across the world in those early Cold War years, and Antonov, despite his quietude and his lack of public prominence, would have grappled with it as intensely as any of his counterparts in the West. The years between 1945 and 1950 were, in many respects, the twilight of Antonov's most influential period. He continued to serve in high positions within the Soviet military establishment, but the nature of his influence was changing. Stalin, who had died in 1953, was still alive in those immediate post-war years, but his grip on the military was loosening in subtle ways. The great marshals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who had been so prominent during the war, were beginning to eclipse even the highest-ranking generals in the public consciousness. And Antonov, who had never sought such prominence, found that his power was increasingly exercised behind closed doors, in staff meetings, and in the preparation of strategic papers, rather than through the grand pronouncements that might catch the attention of historians or propagandists. There is something almost melancholy in this trajectory when one considers it with distance. A man who had shaped the military course of the war, who had stood at Stalin's side when the most consequential strategic decisions were being made, who had possessed a mind that could encompass the movements of millions of soldiers across an entire continent, now found himself in a position where his influence was becoming more muted, more diffuse, less tied to the dramatic turning points that captured the imagination of the world. The war had made him indispensable. The peace seemed to have made him, if not quite peripheral, then certainly less central to the grand narratives that the Soviet state was beginning to construct about its military might. By the early 1950s, Antonov's health was beginning to decline. The strain of the war years, the sleepless nights spent coordinating operations, the psychological toll of strategic responsibility, all of these had accumulated in his body. He continued to work, continued to serve in various capacities within the Soviet military establishment, but there was increasingly a sense that his most vital contributions lay in the past, in those crucial years when his quiet competence had been matched with the desperate need of a nation fighting for its survival. The post-war world, with its new weapons and new uncertainties, required different kinds of thinking, or at least different emphases in strategic thought. And while Antonov adapted to these changes with the same professionalism and thoroughness that had characterized his entire career, there was no escaping the sense that his unique value had been most fully realized in the context of total war, not in the strange half-peace of the Cold War stalemate that was now settling over the world. The years after Berlin moved differently for Antonov than they had during the war. The frenetic pace of operational planning, those nights when every hour contained decisions that would shift the fates of armies, gave way to something quieter, though no less demanding in its own way. He remained in the general staff hierarchy through the immediate post-war years, his expertise too valuable to waste, even as Stalin's paranoia began to cast its long shadow across the officer corps once again. But by then, Antonov had learned the art of invisibility in plain sight, of being essential without being visible, and perhaps that small skill, honed across decades, protected him when so many others found themselves swept away in the new waves of purges and reorganizations that marked the early Cold War. His health, however, had been worn thin by years of stress that few men could have endured. The sleep deprivation of coordinating operations across multiple fronts, the weight of knowing that his calculations and timings would result in the loss of thousands of lives, the unforgiving scrutiny of Stalin, and the demands of an officer corps that could turn vicious at any moment. These things left their marks on the human body in ways that no medal or commendation could repair. Antonov grew older more quickly than his years might suggest, his hair graying, his face taking on the creased, weathered appearance of a man who had carried too much for too long. Those who saw him in the late 1940s and into the 1950s often remarked on his quietness, not as a virtue or a strategic choice anymore, but as something that seemed almost permanent, as though he had spoken his last words of consequence years before and had simply never found reason to speak loudly again. In 1950, he was appointed First Deputy Chief of the General Staff, a position of significant authority, yet one that kept him largely behind the scenes, coordinating the vast machinery of Soviet military planning as the Cold War deepened and the implications of nuclear weapons began to reshape strategic thinking across the world. The problems he now grappled with were different from those of the war. Questions about doctrine, about how to organize a massive peacetime military, about the theoretical implications of weapons that could end civilization itself. These were, in their own way, as complex as anything he had faced before, but they lacked the terrible urgency of active warfare, and perhaps that absence of immediate consequence allowed for something closer to rest, though whether he ever truly rested remains a question that history cannot quite answer. He remained a respected figure within the military hierarchy, consulted by younger officers, regarded by his peers with a kind of reverent distance. Yet even as he held these positions of genuine importance, the Soviet state around him was building monuments to other men. Zhukov, the famous marshal whose strategic vision had earned him prominence and, eventually, danger, Zhukov became the public face of Soviet military genius, the man whom Stalin praised and then demoted, the general whose name appeared in histories and newspapers. Vasilevsky, the chief of the general staff during the crucial middle years of the war, Antonov's superior, and the man under whose authority he had risen to prominence. Vasilevsky received recognition, became a marshal, had his role in history secured in the official narrative. But Antonov, the man whose hands had written out so many of these operations, whose meticulous mind had woven together the complicated threads of logistics and timing that made these victories possible, remained relatively obscure, known fully only to those within the military establishment itself. There is something both melancholy and perhaps fitting in this fact, though it carries a weight of unfairness that softens the sleep of reflection. A man who had devoted himself entirely to competence, to the perfection of his craft, to being the instrument through which his nation's military will was executed, such a man seemed destined, perhaps, to remain partly invisible, not through his own choice necessarily, but through the very nature of the work he had chosen. The brilliant operational planner is, by definition, someone who works behind the curtain. His presence is felt in the precision of an encirclement, in the timing of an artillery barrage, in the way supplies arrive exactly when they are needed. But these things do not make for dramatic photographs or stirring propaganda films. They do not lend themselves to the kind of public admiration that builds statues and ensures a place in the popular memory. This was the paradox of Antonov's later years. He remained important, even essential, to the functioning of Soviet military power, yet he faded from public consciousness almost as though he had never truly occupied the historical stage at all. The war ended, and the men who had commanded the fronts became celebrities of a sort. The marshals received honors and had books written about them. But the thin, grey general who had coordinated it all from behind a desk in Moscow, who had stayed awake through countless nights studying maps and calculating the movements of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, who had earned the trust of Stalin himself through nothing but competence and reliability, he remained a figure known mainly to specialists, to those who studied military history with sufficient depth to understand the actual mechanisms by which the war had been won. In 1954, Antonov suffered a significant health crisis. The details are not extensively documented in the historical record, but it marked a turning point. a signal that his body was beginning to fail him, that the reserves of strength that had carried him through the war years were finally depleting. He continued to work, but with reduced intensity, and his authority, while never explicitly diminished, began to pass to younger men who had not known the war, who had not borne the burden of those decisions, who occupied a world shaped by the atomic age rather than the great mechanized struggles of 1941 to 1945. He died in 1962 at the age of 66, a relatively modest age given his position and importance. The historical record offers little drama around his death, no great deathbed scenes, no poignant final words that have been preserved and repeated. He simply ceased to be, as quietly as he had lived, and the Soviet state, now under Nikita Khrushchev, noted his passing with appropriate military honors, but without the grand ceremonial apparatus that had accompanied the deaths of the marshals. His funeral was attended by significant figures, but it did not capture the imagination of the public or the press. Within months, he had become the sort of historical figure that requires deliberate effort to remember, that does not arise spontaneously in conversation about the war. Yet even now, more than half a century after his death, those who study the Second World War with genuine seriousness, who move beyond the popular narratives and the celebrated names, encounter Aleksei Antonov almost inevitably. The operations that decided the war, the great encirclements and offensives that broke German power on the Eastern Front, these things all bear his fingerprints. The coordination that made such operations possible, the meticulous attention to detail, the understanding of how vast machines of war could be orchestrated, these were, in very substantial measure, his contributions. And perhaps there is a kind of truth, a kind of justice even, in the fact that he remains obscure to the general public. His genius was always oriented toward service rather than self-promotion, toward the perfect execution of a plan rather than the garnering of personal glory. That he should remain known primarily to those who care enough to dig deep into the history, rather than to the casual reader or viewer, seems almost aligned with the nature of his character. The maps he drew are preserved in Soviet archives. The orders he wrote out exist still in their original form, his handwriting visible, his corrections and annotations, a kind of dialogue with history that continues silently across the decades. Historians find him, study him, recognize in him something essential about how the war was actually won, not through the dramatic gestures of famous generals, but through the patient, methodical work of a man who understood that victory requires more than courage, requires the precise coordination of supply lines and movement schedules, the careful calculation of artillery fire, and the timing of assaults. In the collective memory of the Soviet Union, and later in the memory of Russia itself, Antonov occupies a small but meaningful place. Military historians regard him with deep respect. Officers who studied at the Soviet General Staff Academy learned his methods and his principles. His influence persists in the organizational structures and doctrines that shaped Cold War military thinking. Yet to the world at large, to those who encounter the Second World War through popular media and common narrative, his name carries little weight. The marshals are remembered. Zhukov is famous, almost as famous in the post-war world as he was during the conflict itself. But Antonov, the man who made much of what Zhukov achieved possible through the precision of his planning, remains a figure in the shadows. There is something quietly beautiful in this, though it is a beauty tinged with melancholy, the kind of melancholy that settles over a room late in the evening when the work is done and the maps are being carefully folded away. A man spends his entire life perfecting a craft, applying that craft to circumstances of enormous significance, changing the course of history through his work, and then the world largely forgets him, remembers him only in fragments, only when someone bothers to look carefully at the scaffolding beneath the celebrated narratives. It is not an unfamiliar fate for those who work behind the scenes, who are driven by the perfection of their work rather than by the desire for recognition. Yet it remains, nonetheless, a kind of loss, not a loss that Antonov himself perhaps minded greatly, given his temperament, but a loss to the completeness of our understanding, to the clarity of our sense of how history actually unfolds. He left behind no memoir, no great book explaining his thinking or defending his decisions. He gave few interviews in his later years. He did not cultivate a public image or attempt to secure his place in memory through the various devices available to public figures. His legacy rests instead in the operational plans themselves, in the decisions that worked, in the timing that held, in the armies that moved as they were supposed to move, because the planning was meticulous and true. It is a legacy that endures, though it remains largely invisible, present mainly in the structures and doctrines and methods that continue to shape military thought long after his death, influencing soldiers and commanders who may never know his name. There is something peculiar about the architecture of power, the way history tends to remember the voices that carry the furthest, the men who stepped onto platforms and made themselves known through force of personality or spectacle. Yet the actual machinery of grand events, the careful turning of so many small gears, the patient work that makes victory possible, often goes unmarked, unsung, dissolved into footnotes and archival boxes that few will ever open. Antonov was, perhaps, a man of that quieter order, a man whose greatest contributions were rendered in pencil on maps that no longer exist, spoken into telephone receivers to subordinates who themselves have long since passed, committed to memory in the minds of officers who are themselves now dust. What remains is the knowledge that he was there, that the plans worked, that the system functioned with a precision that was almost inhuman. But the human behind that precision, what did he carry? What was the texture of his days? When we think about the men who shaped the 20th century, we often conjure images of uniforms adorned with medals, of speeches captured in grainy film footage, of photographs taken in dramatic lighting. We know these men by their faces, by their reputations, by the rhetoric that surrounded them in life, and the mythology that has grown up in death. But there exists another category of historical figure, one that is perhaps more essential to understanding how things actually happen, yet far more difficult to animate in the popular imagination. These are the men who worked in rooms where sunlight was scarce, where the smell of paper and ink and cigarette smoke hung permanently in the air. Men who understood that victory was not decided in moments of glory, but in the countless small decisions that preceded the clash, in the positioning of reserves 200 kilometers behind the line, in the coordination of supply convoys that had to arrive on precise schedules, in the careful choreography of multiple armies moving across vast territories with the synchronization of instruments in an orchestra. Antonov was such a man, and in tracing his life from that snowy Moscow evening at the beginning, through the catastrophes and slow consolidations that followed, we encounter something like a philosophy of work itself, a quiet assertion that competence, exercised with humility and without ego, can be its own form of power, that there is a dignity in the unglamorous task, in the role that nobody sees but everybody depends upon. How many victories have been won by the people who knew exactly where the supplies were, who understood the true strength of each unit, who could read a situation clearly without needing to perform understanding for an audience? The map rooms of the Soviet General Staff have long since been repurposed or abandoned. The telephones that Antonov used have been disconnected or discarded. The reports he wrote, the orders he drafted, the calculations he performed, most of these have been filed away in archives, available to researchers, but not to the public consciousness. No museum has been built to commemorate the room where he worked. No popular film has dramatized the moments when he sat across from Stalin and delivered information that would determine the fates of millions. And yet, in a strange way, this absence is its own kind of testimony. It speaks to the fact that his work was genuine, that it was not performed for posterity or for the eye of a camera. It was done because the work needed doing, because his country required it, and because he apparently possessed the kind of temperament that could focus on necessities without needing recognition for them. There is a restfulness in contemplating such a life, a kind of peace that comes from recognizing that not all important things need to be visible. Not all architects of history need to be celebrated. Some of the greatest contributions to human endeavors have been made by people whose names were never known outside their own offices, whose reputations never traveled beyond their immediate professional circles. We might think of the forgotten engineers who designed bridges that still stand, the clerks who maintained the records that allowed governments to function, the researchers who solved problems whose solutions were implemented without ever bearing their names. These people were not less important for being obscure. If anything, their obscurity is a measure of their authenticity. They did not work for fame, and so the work itself remains pure, untainted by the distortions that come from performing for an audience. Antonov died in the middle of the 20th century, as the Cold War was beginning its long, grinding contest. He had seen one apocalypse, had helped to navigate it, and was moving into another. He did not live to see the end of the Soviet system that he had served. He did not receive the recognition in death that eluded him in life. Few monuments bear his name. Few schoolchildren learn about him. Yet the plans he made, the systems he helped establish, the standards of competence and precision that he embodied, these rippled forward into the decades that followed, shaping how militaries would think about their own organization, about the relationship between command and execution, about the role of careful planning in the prosecution of large-scale military operations. Consider what it must have been like to sit at his desk in those final years, looking over maps of territories that had been won and then released, watching the world divide itself into two halves, understanding that the vast machinery of war was being converted, piece by piece, into the vast machinery of cold confrontation. Did he wonder about the lives he had touched, the outcomes he had influenced without ever taking the field himself? Did he take any satisfaction in knowing that his work had mattered, even if